What if I told you that fear alone could kill? That a whisper in the night, a rumor in the street, could condemn you to death? In 1692, the small town of Salem became a stage for one of the darkest tragedies in history, the Salem Witch Trials. Neighbors turned on neighbors, innocent lives were lost, and hysteria consumed an entire community. This is not just history. This is a warning of how fear can destroy everything. Welcome to Dark History, where we uncover the shadows of the past. If you want to keep exploring the world's most chilling stories, make sure to subscribe and join us, because what you're about to hear is only the beginning. Chapter 1: The Spark of Fear. Life in Puritan, Salem. Imagine a world where the forest is not a place of beauty, but of dread, where every tree seems to hide the devil himself, and every shadow might conceal his servants. This was life in Salem Village, a small Puritan settlement in the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the late 1600s. To the people of Salem, the wilderness was not just untamed land, it was a constant reminder of chaos, danger, and evil. The Puritans, who settled in New England, had come with a vision to build a city upon a hill, a godly society that would stand as an example to the world. But with that vision came a crushing weight of fear. Fear of the devil, fear of sin, fear of the wrath of God. In their eyes, every sickness, every crop failure, every strange misfortune was not an accident, but a sign of divine punishment, or perhaps even witchcraft. The village itself was tense and divided. Salem was not one community, but two: the prosperous port town of Salem Town, full of merchants and trade, and the smaller, poorer Salem Village, where farmers struggled against the soil and against one another. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Neighbors feuded over property lines, church leadership, and social standing. In such an atmosphere, suspicion was easy to ignite, and once it started, it spread like wildfire. Religion dominated every corner of daily life. The Puritans believed they lived in a cosmic battle between God and Satan, and they saw themselves as foot soldiers in that eternal war. Church sermons thundered with warnings about hellfire, demons, and the constant danger of corruption. The devil was not a distant figure to them. He was everywhere, prowling, tempting, waiting, and they believed witches were his agents, hidden among them. But perhaps the most dangerous ingredient of all was fear itself. Children were expected to obey without question. Women were told to submit, and everyone was taught that even the smallest sin could draw God's anger. To disobey was not only rebellion against the church, but rebellion against God. This left the people of Salem in a fragile psychological state, constantly watching, constantly judging, and constantly fearing that the devil was already among them. In the long, cold winter of 1692, that fear would ignite. It began in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, a man known for his stern sermons and strict rule. Parris was deeply unpopular with many villagers, but he held authority as the minister. His household would become the center of the storm. That changed Salem forever. Inside that parsonage lived his daughter, Betty Parris, just 9 years old, and his niece, Abigail Williams, only 11. Like many children of Salem, they were expected to be silent, obedient, and devout. Yet, in the cold months, boredom crept in. They found themselves drawn to forbidden things, stories, games, and perhaps even whispers of the occult. One enslaved woman in the Parris household, Tituba, had been brought from the Caribbean. To the Puritans, she was a foreigner, a stranger with unfamiliar customs and stories. Historians believe that Tituba may have told the girls tales of spirits, charms, and folk magic practices that were viewed as dangerous and forbidden in Puritan society. To impressionable young minds, those stories became irresistible. Soon after, Betty and Abigail began to act strangely. They screamed without cause. They twisted their bodies into impossible positions. They complained of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. Their fits grew so violent that neighbors whispered in horror. In a society already obsessed with the devil, there was only one explanation: witchcraft. Reverend Parris was frantic. His household was at the center of scandal, and his authority was at stake. Physicians were called, but no natural cause could be found. One doctor even declared that the girls were under an evil hand. The diagnosis was clear: Satan was tormenting them, and this is where the first spark of hysteria turned into flame. Pressured to explain their torment, the girls pointed fingers. They accused 3 women: Tituba, the enslaved woman; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, an older woman who had scandalized the village by refusing to attend church regularly and by marrying her servant. All three were outsiders, women already distrusted by Salem society. It was a deadly combination. In a world where the devil was believed to be real and active, the word of children, filled with violent fits and visions, was enough to condemn the accused. Women were dragged before the magistrates, questioned harshly, and treated as if they were already guilty. Under pressure, Tituba confessed, though her confession was far from ordinary. She claimed that witches were everywhere, and that Salem was filled with Satan's servants. Her words exploded into the community like a spark to dry tinder. If witches were hiding among them, then no one was safe. Anyone could be a witch, your neighbor, your friend, even your own family, and if you doubted it, perhaps that was proof you were one of them. By the end of winter, the accusations multiplied. More girls in the village began to show the same strange fits, and their accusations spread like a plague. Prominent members of the community were named. Husbands accused wives, children accused parents. The village was tearing itself apart. The Salem Witch Trials had begun not with evidence, not with reason, but with fear, paranoia, and the belief that the devil himself walked among them. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in American history, a world where accusation meant death, and where truth was drowned beneath hysteria. As we move deeper into this story, remember this: the Salem Witch Trials were not born from witchcraft, but from fear itself, a fear so powerful that it blinded an entire community, leaving behind a legacy of shame, sorrow, and unanswered questions. This is where the nightmare begins. Chapter 2. The first accusations. The year was 1692, and Salem village stood on the edge of collapse. Whispers of witchcraft had spread through the community like a sickness. The strange fits of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams were no longer private matters, they had become the village's obsession. Neighbors crowded into the parsonage to witness the girls' contortions, their screaming fits, and their wild claims. What they saw terrified them. And then came the question that would shape everything that followed. Who was tormenting these children? The answer arrived in the form of accusation. Under pressure from adults, the girls named 3 women. Their names would go down in history: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Sarah Good was the perfect scapegoat. Poor, homeless, and despised, she survived by begging from neighbors. To the Puritans, poverty was not just unfortunate, it was suspicious. When Sarah Good muttered angrily under her breath after being denied charity, villagers believed she was cursing them. In a world where every misfortune could be seen as the devil's work, Sarah Good was already guilty in their eyes. Sarah Osborne was another easy target. She was an older woman who rarely attended church, already a scandal in Puritan society. But what made her truly infamous was her marriage to her servant. Such a union defied the rigid social order of the time, marking her as a woman who broke rules and defied expectations. To the villagers of Salem, Osborne was not simply sinful, she was dangerous. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Paris household. To the Puritans, her very existence was alien. She came from the Caribbean, spoke differently, and carried knowledge of traditions and stories unfamiliar to Salem. Rumors spread that she had taught the girls charms or spells. Whether or not she had, it didn't matter. In the eyes of the community, she was already tainted with the devil's influence. The 3 women were dragged before the magistrates. The scene was grim. In a crowded meeting house, villagers gathered to witness the first formal interrogations. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin presided over the hearings, their stern eyes fixed on the accused. The girls were brought in as well, their fits intensifying whenever one of the women looked at them. They screamed, clawed at the air, and claimed to see the women's spirits attacking them. To the Puritans, this was proof. How else could the girls know such torment, if not by witchcraft? Sarah Good denied the charges, but her reputation worked against her. When asked why she muttered under her breath, she explained it was out of frustration. But to the magistrates, this sounded like the muttering of curses. When she was asked if she served the devil, she answered with anger, which was taken as further evidence of guilt. Sarah Osborne, frail and sickly, struggled to defend herself. She claimed innocence, but her defiance of social norms made her words hollow to the judges. Her absence from church, her controversial marriage, everything about her life seemed to scream rebellion. And rebellion, in Puritan eyes, was rebellion against God himself. Then came Tituba, At first, she too denied the charges. But under pressure, harsh questioning, intimidation, perhaps even physical abuse, she broke, and when she confessed, she did not simply admit guilt. She told a story that electrified the courtroom. She claimed the devil had appeared to her. She said she had seen a great book, signed by witches, with many names inside it. She spoke of strange animals, a yellow bird, a red cat, a black dog that served Satan, and she insisted that there were many more witches hiding in Salem. Her confession stunned the village. Unlike the others, who denied everything, Tituba gave the Puritans exactly what they feared: proof that the devil was active in Salem, working through his agents. Suddenly, the accusations were no longer about 3 women. They were about an invisible army of witches, hidden among friends, neighbors, and perhaps even family members. The people of Salem were gripped with terror. If witches could be poor, beggars, old women, or enslaved servants, then who else could they be? The answer, in their minds, was simple: anyone. The trials gained momentum. Word spread quickly beyond Salem village. People in nearby towns whispered about the devil's work. The colonial government took notice, and soon, what began as 3 accusations would swell into a frenzy that consumed more than 200 people. But at this early stage, the signs were already clear. Logic and reason had no place here. The rules of evidence were broken. Hearsay, gossip, and the fits of children carried more weight than truth. If a neighbor's cow fell ill, it was blamed on witchcraft. If bread turned moldy, it was a curse. If someone felt a sudden pain, it was an attack by a witch's spirit. And with Tituba's confession, suspicion had no limits. The devil's book, the strange animals, the claim that others were in league with Satan, these ideas turned Salem into a village of paranoia. The people began to look at one another not as neighbors, but as potential enemies. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba became the first prisoners of the Salem Witch Trials. They were thrown into jails, awaiting further judgment. But their arrest was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, more names would be spoken, more accusations hurled, and more lives destroyed. And yet, perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this: the people of Salem believed they were doing God's work. To them, they were not destroying lives, they were saving their community from the devil's grip. This is the danger of fear. When it blinds reason, when it turns suspicion into evidence, when it makes neighbor accuse neighbor. Salem had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. The nightmare was only beginning. Chapter 3. The trials begin. The village of Salem was no longer quiet. By the spring of 1692, the air was thick with unease. Doors slammed a little harder. Conversations hushed when footsteps passed, and eyes lingered on neighbors just a moment too long, searching for hidden signs of evil. Salem was a tinderbox, and the spark had already been struck. The first arrest, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, only the beginning. Their imprisonment had set a precedent. Accusations could destroy lives, and confessions, real or forced, carried enormous weight. The people had seen Tituba's strange visions, heard her talk of the devil's book, and they believed, if the devil truly had allies in Salem, then none were safe until the witches were rooted out. On March 1, 1692, the examinations of the 3 accused women became a public spectacle. The meeting house was filled with villagers, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging the cool air. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin sat at the front, grim and severe, determined to uncover the truth. Before them stood the accused, their chains clinking softly with each nervous movement. The girls who had first claimed affliction, Betty Perris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and others, were brought into the chamber. Their performances were dramatic. Whenever Sarah Good moved, they shrieked that her spirit was pinching them. When Sarah Osborne lifted her eyes, they clutched their throats, gasping for breath. And when Tituba's name was spoken, they convulsed violently, claiming invisible claws raked across their skin. To the villagers, these reactions were undeniable proof. To us, centuries later, they may appear as fear, performance, or perhaps even illness, but in that Puritan meeting house it was evidence stronger than any witness testimony. Sarah Good tried to defend herself. She insisted she was no witch, but every word she spoke only deepened suspicion. When asked why she begged and muttered, she admitted to resentment. When asked if she had made pacts with the devil, she grew angry. Anger, in a Puritan courtroom, was not seen as the response of an innocent woman defending her honor. It was viewed as the devil's fire burning within. Sarah Osborne, weakened by illness, struggled to speak at all. Her pale face and trembling hands gave her the appearance of guilt to those who were eager to see it. She denied the charges, but her reputation had already convicted her. Rare church attendance, her scandalous marriage, her disputes over property Alavit painted her as someone unworthy of God's grace. And then Tituba spoke. At first, she denied the charges, but soon her voice cracked under relentless questioning. The magistrates demanded she confess, and the pressure was unbearable. Finally, she gave them what they wanted, a story. She claimed the devil had visited her, offering riches if she would serve him. She said she had been forced to hurt the children, but she also revealed something far more dangerous, that there were others in Salem, working with Satan. She described strange animals and shadowy figures, painting a terrifying picture of a conspiracy that reached beyond her. In that moment, Tituba transformed the trials. It was no longer about 3 women. It was about the possibility of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of witches hiding in plain sight. Fear exploded into hysteria. The courtroom murmured with shock. The villagers looked at each other, wondering who among them might be signed into the devil's book. Was it the neighbor who argued too often? The midwife whose deliveries sometimes failed? The old man who grumbled at church? Suspicion spread like wildfire. By April, the jails were filling. Martha Corey, a respected church member, was accused, proving that even the godly were not beyond suspicion. Rebecca Nurse, a pious and elderly woman beloved in the community, was soon charged as well. Her arrest shocked Salem. If someone like Rebecca could be called a witch, then truly no one was safe. The trials grew larger and more chaotic. Villagers poured into the meeting house, not just to watch but to participate. Accusers screamed and convulsed on the floor. Witnesses stood to tell stories of cattle that died mysteriously, milk that soured overnight, or tools that broke without cause. Every ordinary misfortune became supernatural evidence. The magistrates did not demand proof as we understand it today. Instead, they relied on a kind of evidence unique to the era: spectral evidence. If someone claimed to see the ghostly image of an accused person tormenting them, it was considered valid. So when Ann Putnam Jr. shrieked that she saw Rebecca Nurse's spectre at her bedside, the court listened. When Mercy Lewis claimed Sarah Good's spirit bit her, it was written down as fact. To us, it seems absurd. To them, it was deadly serious. The devil could take the form of his servants, and if victims testified, they saw these spirits. It was the devil's mark against the accused. The trials also revealed something: darker hidden grievances and long-held resentments. Land disputes, rivalries, and personal grudges began surfacing through accusations. A neighbor who quarreled over property might suddenly be branded a witch. A woman who criticized her peers might find herself accused of sending her spirit to torment children. Fear provided the perfect cover for vengeance. The jail cells overflowed. Prisoners were shackled, kept in filthy conditions, awaiting trial. Families were torn apart. Children watched their mothers dragged away in chains. Husbands tried in vain to defend their wives, only to risk being accused themselves. The atmosphere in Salem was no longer that of a devout, orderly community. It was a theater of fear. Each new accusation fueled the fire, and the villagers were actors caught in a play they could not escape. And through it all, the magistrates believed they were doing God's will. Each question they asked, each confession they forced, each name they recorded, it was all seen as part of a holy war against the devil's army. By May of 1692, the governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, established the Court of Auge and Termina to handle the growing number of cases. This court would soon pass death sentences. The trials had begun in earnest, and the gallows would soon follow. But in this early phase, these first examinations and rising accusations, something vital had already been lost. Reason had been abandoned. Evidence had been twisted into spectacle. Salem had become a village where fear ruled, and hysteria demanded blood. The trials had begun, and they would not end until the soil of Salem itself was stained with the shadows of the gallows. Chapter 4: Spectral Evidence and the Court of Auge and Termina. By the spring of 1692, Salem had become a village trembling under invisible threats. Whispers filled the streets, and even the creak of a floorboard at night could spark suspicion. But the chaos needed a structure, a formal body to handle the swelling tide of accusations. That structure came in May, when Massachusetts Governor Sir William Phips newly arrived from England, established a special tribunal, the Court of Oya and Termina. The words themselves, to hear and determine, signaled the court's mission. What began as scattered examinations in a meeting house was now transformed into an official legal institution, one that carried the power of life and death. The court assembled in Salem town, not far from the harbor. Unlike the cramped meeting house trials, the new proceedings were staged in larger spaces, attracting crowds from nearby villages. Farmers, merchants, and ministers all came to witness what many believed was a holy war disguised as justice. The magistrates presiding included Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, a stern and devout Puritan who would emerge as the most relentless figure of the trials. He was joined by Samuel Sewall, Nathaniel Saltonstall, and others, each man determined to purge New England of Satan's grip. But the trials were not guided by evidence as we know it today. Instead, they relied heavily on something unique to the era: spectral evidence. This was testimony claiming that the accused had appeared in spectral, ghostly form to torment victims. If someone swore they saw the spirit of Rebecca Nurse choking them, or the ghost of Martha Corey clawing at their flesh, it was considered admissible proof. To the Puritans, the devil could not impersonate an innocent person. If your spectre was seen afflicting someone, it meant you had given the devil permission to use your likeness. This belief opened a floodgate of accusations. The afflicted girls, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and others, became central figures in the court. Their contortions, shrieks, and fits became theater for all to see. When they writhed on the floor, screaming that they were being attacked by invisible claws, the judges took it seriously. The audience gasped, murmured prayers, and glanced nervously at their neighbors. Salem had become a stage, and the actors were children guiding the fate of adults. On June 2, 1692, the first major trial under this court began, that of Bridget Bishop. She was a woman in her 50s, outspoken, fond of bright clothing, and known for speaking her mind, traits that stood out in a Puritan world that valued modesty and silence in women. She had already faced accusations of witchcraft years earlier, and though acquitted then, the stigma lingered. Now, under the heavy shadow of hysteria, old suspicions flared anew. The afflicted girls cried out dramatically during her trial. They claimed her spectre pinched them, bit them, and urged them to sign the devil's book. Witnesses added that her cider had spoiled, her hens had died mysteriously, and her behavior was unbecoming of a godly woman. When Bridget Bishop defended herself, saying, "I am innocent, I know nothing of it, I am no witch," her words fell flat in the face of the spectacle around her. The court, swayed by the cries and the so-called evidence, found her guilty. On June 10, Bridget Bishop became the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials. Hanged on Gallows Hill, her death marked the point of no return. With Bishop's execution, the machinery of fear was fully operational. More trials followed rapidly. Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Rebecca Nurse were tried in June. The court treated spectral evidence as decisive. Despite murmurs of doubt, even within the clergy, some ministers worried that Satan could impersonate innocents, but their voices were drowned out by the overwhelming tide of panic. Rebecca Nurse's case struck the community deeply. Known as a pious, elderly woman, she was respected for her devotion and kindness, yet the afflicted girls claimed her spectre tormented them. Even as she stood frail and trembling before the court, the cries of her accusers overpowered her reputation. For a brief moment, the jury acquitted her, but upon hearing the verdict, the afflicted girls erupted in fits so violent that the court demanded reconsideration. Pressured and fearful of public outrage, the jury reversed its decision. Rebecca Nurse was condemned and hanged on July 19, alongside others. Too many villagers. This was proof that innocence and virtue offered no protection. The reliance on spectral evidence turned the trials into a nightmare from which there was no escape. If someone disliked you, they could simply claim your spectre appeared in their dreams or at their bedside. How could anyone defend themselves against accusations rooted in visions? The accused were trapped in a world where denial seemed like further proof of guilt, and confession was often the only path to survival. Though it meant condemning others by naming supposed accomplices, the psychological toll was immense. Families fractured, friends turned on each other. Ministers preached fiery sermons, warning of the devil's army walking among them. Even respected church members like Martha Corey and George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, found themselves accused. Burroughs's case was especially shocking. He was articulate, educated, and had once guided the very congregation now condemning him. His ability to recite the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, a task witches were believed incapable of, should have exonerated him, but the court ignored it. When the afflicted screamed that his spectre appeared above them, the judges saw it as confirmation of guilt. Burroughs was hanged on August 19, praying to God with his final breath. Each execution only deepened the fear. Gallows Hill became a grim stage where the devil's supposed servants met their end. Crowds gathered, some praying fervently, others watching in grim silence. The bodies of the condemned were buried hastily, often in unmarked graves, denied Christian burials. Families wept in secret, fearing that public grief might draw suspicion upon themselves. And still, the accusations spread. By autumn, more than 150 people were imprisoned, awaiting trial. The jails were overcrowded, filthy, and filled with despair. Chains rattled in the dark as prisoners whispered prayers, knowing that the next sunrise might bring their death. Through it all, spectral evidence remained the cornerstone of the prosecutions. Without it, the court's cases would have crumbled, but with it, they convicted ministers, midwives, farmers, and children alike. The afflicted girls held extraordinary power, and their every cry shaped the fate of Salem. Yet cracks began to appear. Some ministers outside Salem, including Increase Mather, warned that spectral evidence was unreliable. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, he wrote, than that one innocent person should be condemned. His words carried weight, but in Salem they were slow to take root. Fear still ruled. The court of Oyer and Termina had unleashed a storm. The gallows claimed life after life, and the colony of Massachusetts trembled under its shadow. Justice had been replaced by hysteria, truth by visions, and mercy by fear. But even as the nooses tightened and the graves filled, dissent was growing. Salem was reaching a breaking point, and soon, the very foundation of the trials, the reliance on spectral evidence, would face a reckoning. Chapter 5. The spread of accusations beyond Salem. The witchcraft panic that began in the small, tightly knit village of Salem did not remain confined within its borders. Like a wildfire leaping from one field to the next, the hysteria spread across neighboring towns and villages, carried by rumor, fear, and the credibility lent by the court of Oyer and Termina. By the summer of 1692, the entire region of Essex County felt the weight of suspicion, and the circle of accusations widened to ensnare people who had never before set foot in Salem village. The initial accusations had been fueled by tensions within Salem itself, property disputes, personal grudges, and simmering rivalries. But once the court had validated spectral evidence and sanctioned executions, the trials gained momentum that no boundary could contain. The afflicted girls' testimonies reached beyond Salem, naming individuals in Ipswich, Andover, and Gloucester. Communities that once thought themselves safe now realized they too could be targets of invisible forces, or, worse, accusations of complicity with them. Andover, in particular, became a hotspot of accusations. In late July, the court ordered the arrest of multiple women from the town, beginning with Mary Lacey Sr., her daughter Mary Lacey Jr., and her granddaughter Mary Lacey III. When interrogated, they turned against each other, each hoping to deflect suspicion by confessing and naming additional accomplices. In a matter of weeks, Andover saw dozens accused, many of them dragged in chains to Salem's overcrowded jail. The panic snowballed, fed by confessions extracted under duress, each name adding new fuel to the fire. The reach of hysteria into Andover shocked many observers. The town had a strong Puritan foundation, a deep commitment to church life, and a sense of stability. But the events revealed a sobering truth. No amount of piety could shield someone from suspicion once fear had taken root. The devil, people whispered, was cunning enough to hide among the godly. The afflicted girls themselves seemed to grow bolder as the net widened. Their performances grew more elaborate, their cries more dramatic, and their fits more violent when new suspects were brought before them. They trembled, shrieked, and collapsed in convulsions, pointing accusatory fingers at strangers as readily as they had at neighbors. Each town they implicated seemed to strengthen their own influence, as if the devil's reach was proof of their importance in God's battle. The geography of the accusations reveals something striking. They often spread along lines of kinship, trade, and old disputes. Families who had long quarreled with neighbors suddenly saw rivals accused of witchcraft. Merchants, with debts to settle, found creditors implicated. Even distant relationships could prove dangerous. Simply being related to someone accused was enough to bring suspicion. Husbands, wives, children, and grandparents were pulled into the storm together, their fates intertwined by blood and fear. One of the most chilling cases involved the family of Rev. Francis Dane of Andover, a respected minister. His daughter Abigail Faulkner was accused, along with her sister Elizabeth Johnson and other relatives, though Dane himself was never formally charged. His household became a symbol of how accusations could pierce even the most upright families. The trials were no longer about the marginalized or eccentric. They were devouring the very pillars of the Puritan community. As the panic spread, the jails overflowed. Ipswich and Boston housed prisoners awaiting trial, many shackled in cold, damp cells for months at a time. Families struggled to survive while their breadwinners languished in captivity. Property was seized, livestock neglected, and farms fell into ruin. The economic toll was as devastating as the emotional one, but still, the court pressed on. By late summer, more than 200 people across Massachusetts had been accused. The web of suspicion stretched so wide that it became nearly impossible to know who might be next. Ministers who had initially supported the trials began to worry privately that their congregations were unraveling. Some, like Cotton Mather, continued to defend the process, insisting that New England faced a genuine spiritual war. Others, like Increase Mather, grew uneasy, warning that the devil could deceive even the most careful observers. Despite these emerging doubts, the executions continued. Sarah Good, who had defiantly declared on the gallows that God would judge her persecutors, left behind a husband and children scarred by the stigma of her trial. George Burroughs, the former minister, was hanged even after reciting the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, a feat that should have exonerated him. His execution shocked many who witnessed it, but the fear of questioning the court kept most silent. In Topsfield, the town family was devastated by accusations. Rebecca Nurse had already been executed, and her sisters Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce faced similar charges. Their cases revealed how family ties became liabilities, each sister's fate dragging the others toward suspicion. When Mary Easty petitioned the court to reconsider the use of spectral evidence, her eloquent plea fell on deaf ears. She, too, was condemned, and her death deepened the sense of injustice among those who dared to whisper doubts. The hysteria even touched Gloucester, a coastal town far from Salem's meetinghouse drama. Fishermen and sailors were accused, blamed for misfortunes at sea or storms that damaged ships. The trials demonstrated how readily natural disasters and everyday struggles could be attributed to witchcraft in a society where the devil was seen as ever-present. A storm that destroyed a harvest, a cow that stopped producing milk, or a child who fell ill. Misfortune could be the spark that led to an accusation. As the summer turned to fall, the spread of accusations began to raise uncomfortable questions. If so many were guilty, could Salem's Puritan experiment ever have been pure? If respected ministers, mothers, and children could be witches, was anyone safe? These doubts gnawed at the edges of the community, but fear kept them from blossoming into outright resistance. The court of Oyer and Termina thrived in this atmosphere of terror. Each new town brought new prisoners, each confession added more names, and each execution reinforced the court's authority. Yet with every noose tightened, every grave dug, the foundation of the trials grew weaker. The further the accusations spread, the more evident it became that the hysteria could not last forever. Salem had lit the match, but Massachusetts was burning, and eventually, the flames would consume themselves. Chapter 6. The Prisoners' Lives, Shackles, Chains, and Despair. To understand the true horror of the Salem Witch Trials, one must not only examine the accusations and executions, but also the bleak and wretched lives of those trapped in colonial jails while awaiting trial. These prisoners, many of whom were innocent men, women, and even children, endured conditions so harsh that they were often described as worse than death itself. The darkness of the Salem hysteria was not only in the gallows but in the cold, damp cells where human beings were reduced to shadows of themselves, chained and forgotten as fear dictated their fate. When a person was accused of witchcraft, the first step was arrest. Constables would arrive, often in the dead of night. pounding on doors while terrified families watched their loved one dragged away. The accused were marched, sometimes barefoot, to nearby towns or directly to Salem village. Shackles clamped around their wrists and ankles were deliberately heavy. Puritans believed witches could fly, so chains weighing up to 14 pounds were used to ground them, preventing any supernatural escape. Once inside the jail, the prisoners were not given trials immediately. Instead, they languished for weeks or months as their cases were prepared. Salem's jail itself was a dark, windowless dungeon built with rough-hewn timber, its air rank with mold and the stench of human waste. The cells were overcrowded, with prisoners forced to sleep on damp straw or directly on the cold ground. Rats scurried freely, gnawing at scraps of rotten food. Lice and fleas were everywhere, infesting hair, clothing, and bedding. Food was scarce and almost never provided by the jailers. Families of the accused were expected to bring sustenance, and if they could not, the prisoners simply starved. Those who had once been farmers, merchants, or respected community members were reduced to begging for scraps of bread and bowls of thin gruel. Water was often dirty and undrinkable. Many prisoners became gravely ill, suffering from dysentery, pneumonia, and fevers that raged untreated. The financial burden of imprisonment fell heavily on families. Jailers demanded fees for everything: the cost of shackles, the use of a cell, even straw to sleep on. Families who already struggled without their primary breadwinner were forced to sell livestock, crops, or household goods to keep their loved ones alive behind bars. It was a cruel irony. Those accused of witchcraft were impoverished by the very process of their confinement, leaving their children and spouses destitute even before a verdict was rendered. Inside the cells, despair festered. Mothers wept for their children left at home, while children accused alongside their parents clung desperately to them in the darkness. Some families were imprisoned together, shackled in neighboring cells, their whispered prayers mingling through the stone walls. For others, separation was complete. Husbands could only imagine the fate of their wives, the suffering of their husbands, and all feared for their children, who often became wards of neighbors or were left to fend for themselves. The psychological toll was immense. The accused lived with the constant terror of trial and execution. Every day, news of another hanging reached the prisoners, sometimes shouted by jailers or whispered from newly arrested inmates. For some, hope flickered briefly when they heard of confessions sparing lives. But that hope was poisoned. Confession meant admitting to consorting with the devil and implicating others, often one's own family or neighbors. To survive, some confessed under pressure, while others clung to their innocence even as the gallows loomed. Confession itself was a torment. In their cells, prisoners were pressured repeatedly to admit guilt. Ministers, constables, and townsfolk visited, urging them to repent and name accomplices. Some broke under the relentless weight of despair, mumbling false confessions just to be spared the rope. Others, like Rebecca Nurse, refused, declaring their innocence until their final breath. For those who confessed, life was not always spared. They were kept shackled, still facing the possibility of trial, as their usefulness depended on how many names they could provide. The treatment of women was especially harsh. Pregnant prisoners, such as Elizabeth Proctor, endured the same fetters and filth as the rest. Elizabeth's husband, John Proctor, pleaded for her release until after childbirth, but the jailers had no mercy. Women gave birth in the darkness of the cells, surrounded not by midwives and family, but by iron chains and foul air. Infants born in prison were frail, and often died within days. One such tragic case was the infant of Sarah Good, who perished shortly after birth. Her mother later hanged. The jail itself became a place of whispered alliances and broken trust. Some prisoners, in desperation, pointed fingers at others in the hopes of earning favor. Friendships dissolved under the weight of suspicion. Yet in the midst of betrayal, there were also moments of defiance. Prisoners prayed together, sang psalms in the dark, and shared what little food they had. For many, faith became their only shield against despair. Children imprisoned faced unimaginable fear. Dorcas Good, only 4 years old, was accused after her mother, Sarah Good, and thrown into a dank cell. Shackled at her tiny wrists, she spent months in darkness, terrified and alone. Even after her eventual release, she was left mentally scarred, her mind broken by the trauma. Her story remains one of the most haunting testaments to the cruelty of the hysteria. The jailers themselves profited from the misery. They extracted fees mercilessly, even as prisoners wasted away. Some stole food brought by families, selling it back to others at inflated prices. Few showed compassion, as fear of witchcraft infected even them. Prisoners were treated less as human beings and more as tainted creatures, cursed by invisible sins. Outside the walls, the community grew accustomed to the growing list of prisoners. At first, arrests shocked neighbors, but as more and more were confined, imprisonment became a grim rhythm of daily life. Each passing cart carrying shackled figures down the road was a reminder of the hysteria's reach. Some townspeople even took satisfaction in seeing rivals behind bars, their disputes conveniently resolved by accusations of witchcraft. Yet, not everyone accepted the cruelty. Some brave souls, though few, tried to support the prisoners. Family members carried food daily, often walking miles to deliver bread or soup through the bars. Others sent blankets, risking accusations themselves for showing compassion. Ministers occasionally visited with Bibles, though some used the opportunity to demand confessions rather than offer true comfort. The prison conditions grew worse as the months dragged on. By autumn of 1692, hundreds were jailed across Massachusetts. Cells, meant for a handful of people, crammed with dozens. The stench grew unbearable, and disease spread like wildfire. The prisoners were not permitted clean water or bathing. Women's hair grew matted, men's beards filthy, and skin ulcerated from flea bites and infections. Some prisoners died before their trials even began, their names quietly erased from the records as though they had never existed. Those who survived day by day clung to slivers of humanity. They carved crosses into wooden walls, etched names into stone, and whispered their stories so that others might remember. For many, the jail was a purgatory worse than the gallows, a limbo of endless waiting, where the only certainty was suffering. When we speak of the Salem Witch Trials, we often recall the hangings and the fiery sermons, but it is within the cold, dark cells of the jails that the human cost becomes most visceral. These were men and women stripped of dignity, chained like animals, and left to rot while their community debated their guilt. Their lives in prison tell a story not of justice but of fear weaponized, of faith twisted, and of humanity abandoned in the face of hysteria. The legacy of their suffering remains. Long after the trials ended, families spoke of the trauma carried by those who survived imprisonment. Children raised without parents, farms left in ruin, minds broken by chains and shadows. These scars did not heal with the closing of the courts. The lives destroyed in those jails stand as silent witnesses to the dangers of unchecked fear and the cruelty that arises when humanity is surrendered to hysteria. Chapter 7: Confessions and Lies. The price of survival in Salem. The line between life and death was not drawn at innocence or guilt, but at confession. Those accused of witchcraft found themselves trapped in an impossible choice: deny the charges and risk the noose, or confess to dealings with the devil, staining their soul with lies, and perhaps live another day. This chapter explores the strange paradoxical system of survival during the Salem Witch Trials, a world where truth was fatal and falsehoods offered a fragile chance at life. The Puritan court operated under the belief that witchcraft was real, and its threat immediate. The afflicted girls claimed to see specters, ghostly apparitions of the accused, tormenting them in visions. This evidence, intangible yet convincing in the eyes of the judges, left the accused with little hope of proving innocence. The only escape was confession, for to admit guilt was to acknowledge the devil's power, but also to signal repentance. Repentance opened the door to forgiveness, at least in theory. At first, confessions were rare. The earliest accused, like Sarah Good and Rebecca Nurse, held firm to their innocence despite endless pressure. To them, confessing to a lie was a mortal sin, a betrayal of both their faith and themselves. But as the trials continued, and the gallows claimed more victims, fear began to outweigh principles. When the first confessions came, they reshaped the trials completely. Take the case of Tituba, the enslaved woman in Samuel Parris's household, one of the very first accused. In February 1692, under interrogation, she broke her confession, stunned the community. She told lurid tales of black dogs, red cats, yellow birds, and a tall man in black who tempted her to serve him. She spoke of signing the devil's book with blood and claimed others in Salem had also written their names. Her confession did not lead to her death. In fact, it saved her life. Tituba remained in jail but was spared the gallows. To the magistrates, her words validated everything they feared, a genuine conspiracy of witches in Salem. And so, confessions became both proof of guilt and fuel for further accusations. Soon, more followed Tituba's path. Some confessed outright, while others wavered, forced to their knees by harsh questioning, sleepless nights, and the sight of neighbors being led to execution. Magistrates pressed them relentlessly. Have you signed the devil's book? Who else was with you? Name them. Each name spoken under duress became another arrest, another link in the chain of hysteria. This created a cycle of survival through betrayal. The more names one provided, the greater the chance of being spared. Confession alone was not enough. It had to be accompanied by fresh accusations. In this way, fear spread like a contagion, consuming families and friendships. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and kin against kin. For those in chains, survival meant condemning others, a torment that weighed heavily on conscience. Consider Mary Osgood, a respected matron. In July 1692, she confessed to signing the devil's book, saying the devil had promised her happiness, but she quickly recanted, declaring her confession false and forced. She was not alone. Many confessed in moments of weakness, then retracted, only to be met with harsher punishment. Judges viewed recantations as proof of the devil's ongoing grip. The community's reaction to confessions was equally twisted. To the faithful, a confession meant victory over a sinner who had been unmasked and was now penitent. Ministers praised these moments in sermons, holding them up as warnings. To others, yet outside the pulpit, suspicion lingered. A confessed witch, even if spared execution, was forever tainted. They were shunned, distrusted, and feared. Their survival came at the cost of their reputation, and many lived in exile within their own communities long after the trials ended. For some, confession was not survival at all, but another form of death. Imagine standing before a crowded meeting house, accused by shrieking children and stern-faced magistrates, then forced to confess crimes you never committed. Every word cut away at your identity, reshaping you into the monster they claimed you were. Confession meant surrendering your name, your honor, and your soul. Even those who lived bore scars invisible. But one particularly tragic aspect of the confession system was its impact on families. Imagine a mother imprisoned with her daughter. The magistrates demand she confess. If she refuses, she may hang. If she confesses, she is pressured to name her daughter as an accomplice. Many families were torn apart by such choices. Some sacrificed themselves to protect loved ones. Others, desperate to survive, implicated kin. The bonds of family and community fractured under the crushing weight of hysteria. Not all confessions were coerced by fear alone. Some saw opportunity. A few prisoners realized that confession granted a strange power. By claiming knowledge of witchcraft, they became valuable to the court, their words eagerly recorded as evidence. This new authority allowed them to settle old scores. Enemies were named, rivals accused, debts repaid in whispers of witchcraft. These confessions, though false, carried deadly consequences for those named. Thus, the trials became not only a theater of fear, but also a weapon of vengeance. Still, many resisted. Those who refused to confess, like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, became symbols of integrity, though their steadfastness led them to the gallows. Proctor, in particular, saw confession as a betrayal of truth itself. When urged to confess falsely, he declared he could not damn his name with lies, famously saying, "Because it is my name, because I cannot have another in my life." His refusal sealed his fate, but his defiance echoed through history as a testament to the power of truth over survival. The paradox of confession highlights the dark logic of the Salem Witch Trials. The court claimed it sought truth, but in reality, it punished honesty and rewarded falsehood. Innocence became a death sentence, while lies became currency. To live, one had to embrace deception. To die with dignity, one had to cling to truth. For the prisoners, nights in their cells became agonizing debates with themselves. Should they confess, dishonoring their faith and integrity, or hold firm and risk execution? Some prayed for guidance, others for strength, and still others for death itself to end the torment. It was not only a physical prison they endured, but a spiritual one. Their souls caught between survival and damnation. The aftermath of confessions was equally devastating. Those who confessed and survived carried their shame for life. They were marked in the community, whispered about in meeting houses, and avoided in marketplaces. Children of confessed witches bore the stain of suspicion for generations. Survival came at a price greater than death, a loss of trust, reputation, and identity. When the trials finally ended, the confessions left a bitter legacy. Some who had confessed sought forgiveness, declaring their innocence anew, but the damage was done. Families of the executed resented those who had confessed and lived. Communities fractured, scars deepened, and reconciliation proved elusive. Salem was left not only with the graves of the innocent, but with a haunting awareness of how lies, once told for survival, could poison a society for decades. The Salem Witch Trials remind us of a chilling truth about human nature. In times of fear, survival can drive people to betray themselves and others. Confessions in Salem were not confessions of guilt, but confessions of despair. They were cries of the powerless, forced to speak the words demanded by their captors. And while those words may have spared the noose, they bound the soul in chains, heavier than iron. In the end, the confessions stand as perhaps the darkest irony of Salem's hysteria. They were the very thing the court valued most, yet they were the least truthful. Lies became the foundation of the trials, and truth was silenced at the gallows. The accused, trapped between survival and honor, left behind a tragic lesson that fear can corrupt not only justice, but the very essence of truth itself. Chapter 8. The Judge's Dilemma. Justice or damnation. When we think of the Salem witch trials, it is easy to focus only on the accused and the afflicted. Yet at the center of the storm sat the judges, men of learning, faith, and authority, with deciding the fate of their neighbors. For them, every decision carried eternal weight. To acquit a guilty, which was to unleash the devil's servant upon their fragile community. To condemn an innocent soul was to stain their hands with blood and risk God's wrath. This was the judge's dilemma: justice or damnation. The men who presided over the trials were not ignorant or cruel caricatures. They were respected figures, landowners, and ministers who sincerely believed they were defending Salem from a spiritual war. Their names still echo through history: Chief Justice William Stoughton, Judge Samuel Sewell, Judge John Hathorne, and others. These men were steeped in Puritan theology, raised on the belief that Satan prowled the world, seeking to corrupt God's chosen. To them, witchcraft was no superstition, it was a real and immediate danger. Yet belief alone could not ease their burden. Every trial demanded judgment. Before them stood trembling men and women, accused of invisible crimes. The evidence was spectral, the testimony hysterical, and yet the judges were expected to deliver justice. It was a task no mortal could perform without error, and deep within, some of them knew it. The courts relied heavily on what was called spectral evidence. This meant that if the afflicted claimed to see the specter, or ghostly shape, of an accused person tormenting them, it was considered valid proof. Ministers themselves debated the legitimacy of such evidence. But in Salem's fevered climate, it became central to the prosecutions. The judges often wrestled with this. Could the devil truly use an innocent person's shape to deceive? If so, then how could any conviction be trusted? To reject spectral evidence, however, was to undermine nearly every case. The dilemma gnawed at them, but fear of underestimating Satan's cunning often tipped the scales toward conviction. Chief Justice William Stoughton stood out as the most unyielding. Stern, zealous, and unwavering, he firmly believed in the righteousness of the court's mission. To him, any hesitation was weakness. Stoughton pressed the accused mercilessly, pushing for confessions, demanding names, and showing little mercy to those who resisted. It was Stoughton who drove the trials forward, his authority shaping their harsh course. In contrast, Judge Samuel Sewell was more troubled. Sewell was a man of faith, but he was also sensitive to doubt. As the trials unfolded, his conscience began to stir. He heard the cries of the condemned, saw the tears of families, and wrestled with the fear that mistakes were being made. Years later, he would publicly confess his guilt and shame, standing in his Boston church to beg God's forgiveness for his role. But in 1692, trapped in the machinery of hysteria, he too delivered verdicts that sent innocents to the gallows. Judge John Hathorne, the great-great-grandfather of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, was notorious for his harsh interrogations. His voice rang through the meeting house as he demanded, "Why do you torment these children?" His questions presumed guilt, cornering the accused into impossible answers. Catherine believed fervently in the devil's presence, and his confidence in the accusations fueled the trial's momentum. The judge's dilemma was not only legal but spiritual. They saw themselves as God's instruments, tasked with purging his flock of Satan's poison. To falter in this duty was unthinkable. Ministers reminded them constantly of the stakes. If witches were left unpunished, God might withdraw his protection from the entire colony. Famine, war, and plague could follow. Thus, in condemning a few, the judges believed they might save the many. Yet doubts lingered, gnawing at the edges of their resolve. When Rebecca Nurse, a saintly woman, beloved by her community, was accused, some judges hesitated. Could such a godly woman truly serve the devil? At her trial, even the jury initially returned a verdict of not guilty. But under pressure from the afflicted girls, the jury reconsidered, and the judges accepted the reversal. Rebecca was hanged. For many, this was the moment that revealed the trial's cracks. If even Rebecca Nurse could be condemned, then no one was safe. Behind closed doors, the judges debated fiercely. Some worried about the reliance on spectral evidence, others feared public opinion, still others wrestled with their own consciences. But in the courtroom, they presented a united front, their authority unbroken. To reveal hesitation in public would invite chaos, and so they buried their doubts beneath stern faces and thunderous verdicts. The judges' dilemma was made worse by the speed of the trials. Accusations poured in faster than they could be processed. The jails overflowed, and pressure mounted to deliver swift justice. Each execution only fueled the frenzy, as the afflicted demanded more arrests. The judges, trapped in a cycle of hysteria, found themselves presiding over a flood they could no longer control. Some tried to justify their choices by pointing to confessions. When an accused witch admitted guilt, the judges seized upon it as validation of their work. Here was proof, they declared, that the devil was indeed at work in Salem. But the confessions were often coerced, born of fear, exhaustion, and desperation. Deep down, some judges must have known this, but to admit it would have unraveled everything. Better to accept the lies than to face the possibility that dozens had died unjustly. The turning point came in October 1692, when Governor William Phips, alarmed by the chaos, dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina. By then, 20 had been executed, and over 100 more languished in prison. The judges, stripped of their authority, were left to reckon with the consequences. Some, like Sewell, sought atonement. Others, like Stoughton, never wavered, convinced until death that their actions were righteous. The legacy of their dilemma is complex. Were the judges villains, blinded by zeal, or were they victims themselves, ensnared in the same web of fear and faith that gripped Salem? History remembers them as both. They were men caught in an impossible storm, their choices shaped by belief, fear, and the weight of responsibility. In their hands, justice became a weapon of hysteria, and damnation, whether of the innocent or their own souls, was unavoidable. In the end, the judge's dilemma was never resolved. Justice and damnation became indistinguishable, blurred by the fog of fear. Their verdicts sent innocents to their deaths, but their silence might have risked the wrath of God, or so they believed. They walked a path with no right answers, only tragic consequences, and in their choices, we see the terrifying power of belief, that even those who seek strict justice can become instruments of injustice when fear guides their hand. Chapter 9. The Prisoners' Lives, Chains, Cold, and Desperation. When we imagine the Salem Witch Trials, we often picture the courtroom or the gallows. But before the accused ever stood trial or faced execution, they endured another ordeal life. Inside the prisons of 1692, it was here, behind the heavy wooden doors and iron locks, that men, women, and even children spent weeks or months awaiting their fate. Their days were filled with fear, hunger, and misery, and their nights haunted by cries and prayers. For many, the prison was as terrifying as the trial itself. The prisons of colonial Massachusetts were not designed for comfort. They were cold, damp, and dark, built less to rehabilitate and more to confine. In Salem Village, the accused were often transported to the larger jails of Ipswich or Boston, or kept in the local dungeon beneath the meeting house. Chains bound their hands and feet, and iron collars were locked around their necks to keep them from escaping or from flying away, as some believed witches could do. The clinking of chains became the constant soundtrack of their captivity. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners slept on hard floors or on thin piles of straw, crawling with lice and fleas. The air was heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, moldy straw, and the waste that collected in buckets. Winter winds pierced through cracks in the walls, leaving the accused shivering in thin garments. In the summer, the cells grew stifling, suffocating prisoners in heat and foul air. Food was meager: coarse bread, water, and sometimes thin broth, brought by family members if they could afford it. Those who had no money suffered most, for jailers demanded fees for everything: room, board, and even the chains that bound their bodies. Poverty itself became a punishment. For the accused, prison was not only a physical trial but a spiritual one. Each day was a reminder of their uncertain fate. They prayed constantly, pleading for God's mercy. Some clung to hope, insisting on their innocence, while others broke down under the weight of despair. The sound of weeping was common, mingled with whispered prayers and the rattling of chains. At night, the cries of one prisoner often set off a chorus of voices, echoing through the stone walls like a dirge for the living. Families suffered alongside the accused. Husbands were torn from wives, mothers from children. Some children, accused themselves, were locked up with adults, exposed to the same hardships. Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, spent months in prison, terrified and confused, chained like a criminal. Many mothers wept not for themselves but for their children, who bore the punishment of accusations they could not even understand. Prison also became a place of pressure. Jailers and ministers urged the accused to confess. A confession often meant survival, at least for the moment, as those who admitted guilt were sometimes spared the gallows. But confessing meant damning oneself as a servant of the devil, and worse, it meant naming others as accomplices. Some, desperate to escape execution, confessed and accused neighbors, feeding the frenzy outside the prison walls. Others, like Rebecca Nurse and Martha Corey, refused to confess, choosing death over dishonor. The walls of the jail witnessed these agonizing decisions, the clashing of survival and integrity. The prisoners shared their suffering. Though some mistrusted one another, many found comfort in shared prayers and whispered conversations through the bars. Bonds formed in those dark cells, forged by the common weight of chains. Some prisoners, once free neighbors, now became family in captivity, united by the same terror of the noose. The sounds of the outside world haunted the prisoners. From their cells, they could sometimes hear the tolling of church bells, the laughter of children playing, or the voices of townspeople above. Each sound reminded them of the lives they had lost and might never return to. And worse, when executions took place, prisoners could sometimes hear the distant drumbeats, the footsteps of the condemned, or even the crowd's murmur as another soul was led to Gallows Hill. Those who remained behind lived in constant dread, wondering when their own turn would come. Illness spread quickly in the jails. Cold, malnutrition, and filth bred disease, and the weak often grew weaker. Some prisoners died before they ever faced trial, their names forgotten in the rush of hysteria. For them, prison itself was the executioner. Their bodies were carried out quietly, buried without ceremony. As the frenzy outside raged on, yet in the midst of misery, moments of humanity flickered. Families brought food, blankets, and letters of encouragement when allowed. Ministers visited, urging repentance but also offering prayer. In the darkest nights, prisoners sang psalms together, their voices trembling but defiant. These acts of faith sustained them, even as the walls closed in. The psychological torment was perhaps the cruelest. Every day was filled with uncertainty. Would they be tried tomorrow? Would the judges believe their pleas of innocence? Would their names be cleared, or would the gallows await? This endless waiting broke spirits. Some prisoners wept until they had no tears left. Others grew silent, staring blankly into the shadows. Time in prison felt endless, each hour stretching into eternity. For those who confessed, prison brought a different agony. Though they sometimes escaped execution, they lived with the shame of betrayal. Their confessions condemned others, feeding the very machine that had ensnared them. Some later recanted, declaring their innocence once more. But by then, the damage was done. Guilt gnawed at them, even as they survived. The jails also revealed the stark contrast between the poor and the wealthy. Those with means could sometimes purchase better treatment, softer beds, warmer clothing, or larger cells. The poor, by contrast, rotted in the worst conditions. Salem's hysteria did not erase social divisions. it deepened them. For many of the poor, prison was not only a punishment for alleged witchcraft, but also for their poverty. As months passed, the jails grew overcrowded. Dozens of men and women packed into narrow spaces, their chains clattering as they shifted. The noise, the smell, the fear, it all became unbearable. Jailers themselves grew weary of the task, but the frenzy outside demanded more arrests, more prisoners, more misery. The release of prisoners, when it came, was often bittersweet. Some were freed when the trials collapsed, but they returned to lives shattered by captivity. Homes were lost, reputations destroyed, and health broken. For many, prison scars lasted a lifetime. They carried memories of chains and darkness with them, reminders of the hysteria that had stolen their freedom. Then in the end, the prisons of Salem were as much a symbol of the trials as the gallows. They represented the cruelty of fear, the way hysteria could strip people of dignity before their lives were even judged. Behind those walls, ordinary men, women, and children became shadows of themselves, reduced to suffering and waiting. The story of the Salem Witch Trials is often told through the courtroom and the hangman's rope, but the prisons hold their own dark chapter. Here, in chains and cold, we see the human cost of fear. We see neighbors turned into prisoners, faith tested by misery, and lives wasted in the name of protection against an invisible enemy. The gallows ended lives, but the prisons broke spirits long before the noose tightened. Chapter 10: The Turning Tide. Doubts, resistance, and voices of reason. For months, the hysteria in Salem had consumed nearly every corner of daily life. Families were divided, neighbors turned against neighbors, and fear silenced the voices of reason. But as summer faded into autumn of 1692, cracks began to appear in the frenzy. Doubt crept into the hearts of the people. For the first time, some began to question whether all the suffering, all the deaths, and all the accusations were truly the work of witches, or whether something far more human was at play. The first signs of resistance came not from strangers, but from those closest to the accused. Husbands pleaded for their wives, children for their mothers, and ministers for their They pointed out the character of the accused women and men who had lived good, faithful lives, now suddenly branded as servants of Satan. How could Rebecca Nurse, a devout and charitable woman in her 70s, be a witch? How could John Proctor, a respected farmer, suddenly be an enemy of God? The accusations began to feel less like divine truth, and more like human folly. Even the courts could not ignore the growing unease. Early in the trials, spectral evidence, testimony that someone's spirit had appeared to torment the afflicted, had been enough to convict. But as the number of accused swelled into the dozens, and as some of the colony's most respected citizens were dragged into prison, doubts grew louder. Could invisible specters truly be trusted as proof of guilt? If so, then no one was safe. Anyone could accuse anyone, with no way to disprove it. Ministers, once silent or even supportive of the trials, began to question the validity of the evidence. Reverend Increase Mather, a respected Puritan leader, famously declared, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned." His words carried weight, and they echoed through the colony. If even one innocent life had been taken, was the court itself guilty of sin? The seed of doubt had been planted, but doubt did not spread easily. The afflicted girls continued their fits, screaming and contorting in courtrooms, insisting that witches tormented them. Many still believed them, convinced that to question the afflicted was to side with the devil. Yet others noticed inconsistencies. The girls' accusations often shifted, their visions tailored to match suspicions. What began as terrifying certainty now began to look like theater. Some of the accused also grew bolder. John Proctor, before his execution, spoke out fiercely against the court, declaring it unjust and corrupt. His words, preserved by memory, struck at the heart of the hysteria. "We are only what we always were, but now we are accused." His defiance shamed those who watched, for in his dignity he exposed the cruelty of the system. Others followed his lead, refusing to confess or name names, choosing death over dishonor. Their courage planted further doubt. The sheer number of accusations also forced reflection. Nearly every family had been touched by the trials, either through imprisonment, accusations, or the constant threat of being named next. When so many were condemned, the line between guilty and innocent blurred. Could it truly be possible that so many in a God-fearing community had sold their souls to Satan? Or was it more likely that fear itself had run wild? Economic and social tensions also played a role in the turning tide. Some noticed that accusations often fell on the poor, the widowed, or those who owned disputed land. Others realized that confessors, who admitted to witchcraft and accused others, were more likely to survive than those who maintained their innocence. Slowly, people began to suspect that the trials were not only about the devil, but about power, property, and survival. By the autumn of 1692, resistance had grown too strong to silence. Prominent citizens petitioned the governor, urging him to reconsider the courts. Ministers warned that Satan could deceive not only the afflicted, but the judges themselves, twisting their pursuit of justice into injustice. And families, mourning their loved ones, demanded that the executions end. The turning point came in October. Governor William Phips, alarmed by the growing unrest and influenced by the words of Increase and Cotton Mather, intervened. He ordered an end to the use of spectral evidence in trials, striking at the very heart of the hysteria. Without spectral visions, many cases collapsed. The flood of accusations slowed, and the gallows fell silent. The trials did not end overnight, but the tide had shifted. The very people who once cheered for executions now whispered doubts in the streets. The afflicted girls, once feared, now faced suspicion themselves. Their power waned as the colony awakened from its nightmare, yet the damage had been done. 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and more than 100 imprisoned. Families were torn apart, reputations ruined, and faith in the courts shattered. The turning tide brought relief, but also shame. Salem's people began to realize the truth. They had been swept away by fear, and in their panic, they had sacrificed the innocent. The resistance did not erase the tragedy, but it opened the door for reflection. It forced the community to confront its own failings, its blindness, its cruelty, its willingness to believe fear over reason, and it reminded them of a painful truth, that hysteria, once unleashed, is not easily controlled. The Salem Witch Trials would never be forgotten, not because of the fear that began them, but because of the courage of those who questioned, resisted, and spoke the truth when it was most dangerous to do so. Their voices of reason broke through the storm, reminding Salem and the world that justice must be rooted in evidence, not in fear. Chapter 11: The Collapse of the Trials, Mercy, Pardon, and the End of the Gallows. By the late autumn of 1692, the frenzy that had ignited Salem was beginning to sputter. For months, the courts had been filled with shrieks, fits, and accusations. The gallows had claimed the lives of neighbors and friends. The prisons overflowed with men and women awaiting trial. Yet now, a change was stirring. The doubt that had once whispered in secret was growing into something stronger. It was no longer just murmurs in the meeting houses or worried glances on the street. Resistance had reached the halls of power. Governor William Phips had returned from the front lines of a war with the French and native tribes in Maine to find his colony consumed by witchcraft trials. At first, he had trusted the court of Oyer and Terminer, the special tribunal he himself had commissioned to handle the surge of witchcraft cases. He believed the judges, many of them men of faith and learning, would seek truth guided by God. But the sheer scale of accusations and the mounting executions forced his hand. Something had to change. The turning point came when spectral evidence was finally called into question. For months, the afflicted girls had claimed to see specters, ghostly shapes of witches tormenting them. This invisible evidence, unprovable and unfalsifiable, had condemned dozens. But now, under growing criticism from ministers like Increase Mather, Phips decreed that spectral evidence could no longer be the basis for conviction. With one decision, the tide of the trials shifted dramatically. Without spectral evidence, the cases against many prisoners unraveled. How could one prove witchcraft without the invisible visions? Suddenly, the courtrooms that had been filled with chaos fell eerily quiet. The girls still performed their fits, but the judges no longer leaned so heavily on their words. The drama lost its power, but the damage had already been done. The executions had not yet stopped. Giles Corey had been pressed to death in September, crushed under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. His death haunted the colony, a grim reminder of the cruelty that fear had birthed. On September 22nd, 8 more people were hanged, including Martha Corey, Mary Easty, and Samuel Wardwell. Their final words echoed with dignity: mercy, and faith, words that made it harder for onlookers to believe they were servants of Satan. After that September day, however, the gallows never claimed another life in Salem. The trials continued in name, but the will to condemn had been broken. The same people who once crowded the execution grounds now whispered their unease. The cries of the accused families grew louder. The ministers spoke with more urgency, and Governor Phipps himself, realizing that chaos was tearing the colony apart, dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer in late October. In its place, a new court was established, the Superior Court of Judicature. This court took a much stricter stance. Without spectral evidence, many of the accused were acquitted. Even those found guilty were often spared execution. Mercy began to replace vengeance. Petitions poured in from families begging for pardons. Some were granted, others delayed, but the momentum had shifted. Where once the accused had little hope of survival, now they had a chance. The colony's appetite for blood had been sated. Perhaps it had soured. By early 1693, Governor Phipps went further. He issued a general pardon for many of the accused still languishing in jail. Prison doors creaked open, releasing men and women who had endured months of chains, starvation, and humiliation. Families were reunited, though the scars of their suffering remained. The collapse of the trials was not a moment of triumph, but of exhaustion. Salem had burned itself out in a frenzy of fear, and now the embers were dying. But in their place lay ashes, lives destroyed, reputations ruined, and a community forever changed. The people of Salem began to reckon with what had happened. Some confessed regret for their roles. Jurors who had voted guilty signed petitions, admitting they had been deceived. Even the judges, once steadfast in their rulings, expressed shame. Samuel Sewall, one of the chief judges, stood before his congregation in January of 1697, publicly confessing his guilt and begging for God's forgiveness. His words carried the weight of a man who knew he had blood on his hands. But not all were quick to repent. Some of the accusers, the afflicted girls themselves, never fully admitted their deception or hysteria. Ann Putnam Jr., years later, would express sorrow and claim she had been misled by Satan. But others lived out their lives in silence, neither confessing nor apologizing. The truth of their motives, fear, attention, manipulation, or belief. One of the great mysteries of Salem, the collapse of the trials, also raised troubling questions. If the court had been wrong, what did that mean for the 19 people executed? What did it mean for the dozens who had confessed under pressure, believing it the only way to save themselves? Had the colony killed innocent people? The answer, though unspoken, was unavoidable. For those who had lost loved ones, the end of the trials brought no comfort. Wives were widowed, children orphaned, estates seized, and reputations tarnished. Even when pardons were granted, the stigma lingered. To be accused was to be marked forever, whether or not one survived. The end of the gallows marked the end of the most dramatic phase of the Salem Witch Trials, but it did not erase the pain. Instead, it forced the colony into reflection. Salem had been gripped by fear, but it was human hands, not supernatural ones, that had built the scaffold, tied the nooses, and dropped the floorboards. In the years to come, Massachusetts would take slow steps toward justice. The government issued compensation to some of the families of the victims, though the money could not bring back the dead. The colony declared days of fasting and repentance, seeking God's mercy for the sins committed in Salem, and historians, theologians, and ordinary people would debate endlessly how such madness had overtaken a community of faith. The collapse of the trials did not undo the past, but it signaled a lesson about fear, about justice, and about the danger of allowing hysteria to replace reason. It was a lesson written in the names of the dead, in the silence of those who survived, and in the shame of those who had once believed they were serving God. And so, as 1693 dawned, Salem stepped out of its darkest chapter. The noose was put away, the gallows stood empty, the prisons slowly emptied, and the colony, though scarred, began the long and painful process of healing. But the memory of those dark months, the cries in the courtroom, the bodies on Gallows Hill, the tears of the families would never fade. Salem would forever be haunted, not by witches, but by its own fear. Chapter 12. Life after the trials. Survivors, orphans, and broken families. When the hangings ceased and the prison doors began to creak open in early 1693, one might imagine that peace finally returned to Salem. But the truth was far more complicated. The collapse of the witch trials did not simply erase the devastation they had caused. Instead, the end of the gallows ushered in a new kind of suffering, one quieter, but no less painful. The survivors of the hysteria were left to pick up the pieces of broken families, ruined reputations, and shattered trust. Salem itself had become a wounded community, scarred by the choices it had made. The men and women who walked free from prison did not step back into the lives they had once known. For months, some of them had been crammed into damp, disease-ridden cells, chained at the ankles, starved, and stripped of dignity. Many carried physical scars from the irons that had cut into their flesh. Others bore invisible wounds, humiliation, trauma, and grief. The world outside had moved on without them. Land had been seized, businesses lost, and children forced into servitude to pay for their parents' imprisonment. Though pardoned, they returned not as neighbors, but as people tainted by suspicion. For those who had confessed to witchcraft in order to save their lives, the stigma was even heavier. These confessions, wrung out under duress, remained on record. They had been spared the gallows, but at the price of publicly branding themselves as witches. In a Puritan society where reputation was everything, such a mark could never fully be erased. Some confessed witches lived in quiet shame, never truly welcomed back into the fold of their community. Others tried to rebuild, but the whispers followed them until their deaths. The children bore the deepest scars. Many had watched their parents dragged away in chains or hanged on Gallows Hill. Husbands lost wives, wives lost husbands, but children often lost both. The orphaned were left to be raised by distant relatives, neighbors, or in some cases, strangers. They inherited not only grief, but also poverty and stigma. A child whose mother had been accused of witchcraft carried a burden that could shadow them for life. Some never married, others drifted on the margins of society. Reminders of the madness Salem had unleashed. Take, for example, the children of Martha and Giles Corey. Both parents had been condemned. Martha hanged, Giles pressed to death. Their property was seized, their name blackened, and their children left to fend for themselves in a community that had destroyed their family. Or the daughters of Sarah Good, who had clutched her infant in prison until the baby starved to death. Her surviving child grew up carrying the memory of her mother's execution, marked forever by the tragedy. Those who had accused their neighbors also found themselves living in the aftermath. At first, the afflicted girls had been celebrated as instruments of God, saving the colony from Satan's grip. But when the trials ended and the community turned against the hysteria, many began to see these girls in a darker light. Had they lied? Had they exaggerated? Had they been used? The truth was tangled in layers of belief and manipulation, but the result was clear. Their reputations, too, were scarred. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prominent accusers, eventually offered a public apology years later, admitting that she had been deceived by the devil and misled into accusing innocent people. But at the time, in 1693, she and the others were left to live among neighbors who now eyed them with suspicion. The very voices that had condemned dozens to death were no longer trusted. Fear had made them powerful. Now it made them dangerous, reminders of Salem's shame. The ministers and judges also had to face the consequences. Judge Samuel Sewall stood before his congregation in 1697 and confessed his guilt, taking responsibility for the blood that had been shed. His act of public repentance was rare and deeply significant, a moment that echoed across the colony. But not all were willing to repent. Chief Justice William Stoughton, who had presided over the trials with fervor, never apologized. He insisted that the court had acted justly, and he carried his decisions to the grave. For many in Salem, this refusal to admit wrongdoing deepened the wound. Survivors and families of the executed began to petition for justice. They sought to clear the names of the dead, to restore reputations, and to reclaim confiscated property. The process was long and painful. The government was slow to respond, and when it did, the restitution was partial and inadequate. Money could not heal grief, nor erase the memory of watching a loved one hanged for a crime they did not commit. But for some, even small gestures mattered, a recognition that their suffering had been unjust, that their family members had not been witches, but victims. The social fabric of Salem was torn. Neighbors who had once trusted each other now avoided eye contact in the streets. Families who had testified against friends no longer broke bread together. The church, meant to be the center of unity and faith, struggled with division and guilt. Salem was not just a town that had executed 19 people, it was a community that had betrayed itself. The shadow of the trials lingered in everyday life. At meals, empty seats at the table served as reminders of those who would never return. In the fields, farms that had once been prosperous stood abandoned. Children played without their mother's guidance, or learned trades without their father's hands to teach them. For many, the silence of absence was the most haunting reminder of all. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors described nightmares, hauntings, and visions of the trials. Some believed the colony had indeed been cursed in it by witches, but by God, for its injustice. Days of fasting and repentance were declared, as the community sought forgiveness for its sins. But guilt was not easily washed away. For years, Salem was a place haunted not by spirits, but by memory. Yet amid the ashes of grief, resilience began to stir. Families who had been torn apart began to rebuild. Widows learned to manage farms on their own. Orphans grew into adults determined to carry on, even with the weight of their past. Some of the accused who had survived used their experiences as quiet lessons, reminding others of the dangers of hysteria and blind belief. Slowly, painfully, Salem began to heal. The trials had ended, but their legacy had only begun. In the lives of survivors, in the tears of orphans, and in the silence of broken families, the story of Salem did not fade. Instead, it became a cautionary tale whispered to future generations, a reminder of how fear could consume reason, and how justice could be lost in the shadow of hysteria. Chapter 13. The Confessions. Why the accused admitted to witchcraft. One of the most puzzling and haunting aspects of the Salem Witch Trials is the question of why so many accused men and women confessed to crimes they did not commit. In a society where honor, faith, and reputation meant everything, why would a person willingly admit to being a witch, a crime punishable by death and eternal damnation? To answer this, we must look into the deep psychological, religious, and social pressures that crushed the accused until many broke, offering false words that would save their lives but stain their names forever. From the very beginning, confession was presented as the only path to survival. Unlike in Europe, where confessions often led straight to execution, in Salem, a confession of witchcraft could mean escape from the gallows. The Puritan authorities believed that those who confessed could still be redeemed through repentance. This created a cruel paradox: deny the charge and face hanging, or admit to an unthinkable lie and be spared. For many trapped in the cold darkness of Salem's jails, survival became the stronger instinct. The conditions in those jails were brutal. Prisoners were chained by the ankles, their bodies pressed against damp stone floors. Food was scarce, often moldy or rotten. Disease spread quickly in the unventilated cells, and the winter air crept in through cracks in the walls. Families had to pay the jailers for the privilege of keeping their loved ones locked away, selling land or possessions just to provide straw for them to sleep on. In this misery, the promise of life, any life, no matter how tempting. But it wasn't only survival that pushed confessions. The interrogations themselves were designed to break the human spirit. Judges and ministers demanded answers for hours on end, often twisting the accused words into signs of guilt. If someone hesitated, it was considered proof of deception. If someone grew angry, it was taken as the devil's influence. With no hope of convincing the court of innocence, many realized that resistance was useless. Confessing offered an end to the endless questioning, the shouting, and the weight of accusation. There was also a deeply religious dimension to confession. In Puritan belief, the soul's fate was paramount. Ministers preached that admitting sin, no matter how grave, opened the door to God's mercy. To refuse to confess, even falsely, was seen as prideful, a sign of resistance to divine will. The accused were told that by admitting to witchcraft, they could unburden their souls and reclaim God's grace. This twisted theology turned lies into a form of salvation. Those who clung to their innocence risked being labeled unrepentant and thus damned, not only in this life but in the eternal one beyond. For some, fear was compounded by manipulation. The accusers, especially the young girls, often pressured the accused to confess, insisting that they had seen them consorting with the devil. When neighbors, ministers, and even family members echoed these claims, the accused were surrounded on all sides by voices demanding guilt. Imagine standing in a courtroom where dozens of people insisted they had witnessed your invisible crimes. To resist such a tidal wave of accusation required strength few could muster. For many, it was easier to surrender and confess, even if the words burned their tongues. One striking example is the case of Tituba, the enslaved woman whose testimony in 1692 became a turning point in the trials. When first accused, she denied involvement in witchcraft, but under the pressure of interrogation and likely fear of brutal punishment she changed her story. She confessed not only to practicing witchcraft, but also described wild, vivid scenes of devilish conspiracies. She spoke of black dogs, red cats, and witches flying through the air. Her confession confirmed the minister's fears of a vast satanic plot, and her words fueled the hysteria that followed. Tituba's confession spared her life, but it unleashed a storm that consumed others. Confessions also became contagious. Once one person admitted guilt, others were expected to do the same. The court asked those who confessed to name other witches, creating a deadly cycle. Confession became not just a survival tactic, but a weapon, shifting suspicion from oneself to others. Under this system, silence was dangerous, and naming names was seen as cooperation. This meant that a single confession could set off a chain reaction, drawing in neighbors, relatives, and even church members. The truth mattered less than the momentum of accusation. For those who confessed, the price was steep. They escaped the noose, but they lived under the shadow of shame. Their neighbors looked at them differently, whispering about their supposed dealings with the devil. Some tried to reintegrate into society, but the stigma of witchcraft never fully faded. In Puritan New England, reputation was everything, and a confessed which was forever marked. No matter how loudly they professed repentance, it was survival at the cost of honor. Not all accused followed this path. Some chose silence, even in the face of death. Rebecca Nurse, an elderly and respected woman, refused to confess. Her faith was unwavering, and she went to the gallows proclaiming her innocence. Martha Corey, too, stood firm, denying the charges to the end. Perhaps most striking was Giles Corey, who refused to enter a plea at all. For his defiance, he was pressed to death under heavy stones. His last words reportedly, "More weight." These refusals stand as powerful contrasts to those who confessed, showing that in Salem, every accused person faced a tormenting choice between survival and integrity. The phenomenon of false confession in Salem also reveals something deeper about human psychology. When placed under extreme pressure, fear of death, physical torment, social isolation, people can be pushed into saying things they know are untrue. The desire to escape suffering, to cling to life, can outweigh the commitment to truth. Salem's confessions were not admissions of reality, but echoes of a broken system that demanded guilt, whether it existed or not. In the years after the trials, many who confessed lived quietly, their stories rarely told. They had survived, but survival was not victory. Their names were still poisoned, their families still marked. Some later expressed regret, wishing they had stood firm like Rebecca Nurse or Giles Corey. Others remained silent, carrying the secret weight of their falsehood. Until the end of their days, the confessions also left a troubling legacy for Salem itself. They showed how easily truth could be twisted, how justice could be manipulated, and how faith could be weaponized. They revealed the terrifying power of authority to shape reality, forcing people to admit to crimes that never existed. And they remain a warning to history, that under the weight of fear and hysteria, even the strongest convictions can crumble. In the end, the confessions of Salem were not confessions of guilt. They were confessions of despair, statements born from the crushing weight of fear, faith, and survival. They were the words of people trapped in a world gone mad, where truth no longer mattered and only submission offered escape. Their voices echo through history, not as proof of witchcraft, but as proof of the human will to endure, even at the cost of the soul. Chapter 14. The role of religion and the Puritan faith in fueling the trials. To understand the Salem Witch Trials, one must step into the heart of Puritan New England, a society where religion was not simply a part of life, which was life itself. Faith governed every aspect of existence, from the rhythms of daily labor to the laws of the colony. The Puritans who settled in Massachusetts Bay saw themselves as a chosen people, tasked with building a godly community in a wilderness they believed was filled with both physical and spiritual dangers. Against this backdrop, the witchcraft hysteria of 1692 was not an anomaly. but rather the grim flowering of beliefs deeply rooted in Puritan thought. The Puritans lived with an unshakable sense of spiritual warfare. To them, life was a constant battle between God and Satan, between the forces of light and the powers of darkness. Every illness, every crop failure, every misfortune could be attributed to the devil's hand. Witches, in Puritan theology, were not merely superstitious fantasies, they were Satan's foot soldiers, active agents of evil sent to destroy God's kingdom on earth. To tolerate witches was to betray God himself. This rigid worldview made accusations of witchcraft deeply believable and dangerously compelling. Central to Puritan belief was the doctrine of predestination, the idea that God had already chosen who would be saved and who would be damned, while nothing a person did could change their eternal fate. Puritans believed that visible signs of holiness or corruption revealed the hidden truth. When someone exhibited strange behavior, fell into unexplained illness, or clashed with their neighbors, it could easily be interpreted as evidence of God's judgment or Satan's influence. In this atmosphere, the line between spiritual discernment and paranoia blurred quickly. The Puritan ministers were among the most powerful figures in society, and their sermons shaped the public mind. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of sin, the wrath of God, and the constant threat of the devil. In 1692, when strange fits afflicted young girls in Salem village, ministers immediately reached for spiritual explanations. They reminded their congregations that Satan prowled like a roaring lion, seeking souls to devour. Such teachings primed the community to see witchcraft not as superstition, but as a terrifying reality in their midst. Religion also shaped the legal framework of the trials. In Puritan New England, church and state were deeply entwined. The colonies, laws were drawn from biblical principles, and the magistrates who presided over the courts saw themselves as instruments of divine justice. The Bible's injunction, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," was not treated as metaphor but as command. For the Puritan judges, failure to prosecute witches was failure to obey God's law. This made the courts not neutral arbiters, but zealous defenders of faith, ready to punish in God's name. The role of confession and repentance further reveals how religion fueled the madness. Ministers taught that sin, no matter how dark, could be forgiven if admitted and repented. This meant that confessions of witchcraft were not only tolerated but encouraged. To deny the charge was to risk eternal damnation, while to confess even falsely was framed as an act of humility before God. This twisted theology placed unbearable pressure on the accused, turning their faith into a weapon against them. Puritan obsession with purity also played a crucial role. They sought to create a community without blemish, a shining city upon a hill that would serve as a model for the world. Any perceived corruption, whether sin, dissent, or witchcraft, was seen as a threat to the entire society. This fostered an atmosphere of suspicion, where differences in behavior, beliefs, or even personality could be viewed as dangerous. Those who did not conform perfectly to Puritan norms, such as outspoken women, the poor, or the marginalized, were easy targets for accusation. It is also important to understand how religion and fear fed each other. The Puritans lived in a world of constant uncertainty, harsh winters, deadly epidemics, raids from native groups defending their lands, and conflicts with the French on the northern frontier. In such times of hardship, ministers framed these events as signs of God's displeasure. The devil, they preached, was constantly seeking ways to infiltrate the community. This worldview created a fertile ground for hysteria. When misfortune struck, it was easy, almost inevitable, to blame invisible enemies. One cannot overlook the specific influence of Cotton Mather, one of the most prominent ministers of the time. Though he did not directly preside over the trials, his writings and sermons shaped the intellectual climate. In his book Memorable Providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions, published just a few years earlier, Mather detailed supposed cases of demonic possession in Boston. His vivid accounts of children tormented by witches created a cultural script that mirrored what unfolded in Salem. When the afflicted girls screamed, convulsed, and claimed to see spirits, their behavior followed patterns already seeded by Mather. Religion also justified the use of spectral evidence, the most controversial aspect of the trials. Ministers and judges accepted the testimony of the afflicted girls, who claimed to see the specters or spirits of witches tormenting them. Though invisible to everyone else, these visions were treated as proof of guilt. To question the validity of spectral evidence was to question the reality of the spiritual world itself, and thus to undermine the Puritan faith. This made the courts dangerously receptive to accusations that had no grounding in physical fact. The Puritan faith also amplified the gendered nature of the trials. Women, seen as spiritually weaker and more vulnerable to the devil's temptations, were far more likely to be accused. Religious teachings reinforced stereotypes of women as Eve's daughters, prone to sin and in need of male guidance. Independent, assertive, or non-conforming women threatened this patriarchal order and were often targeted. Religion thus provided not only the theological justification for witch hunts, but also the cultural framework that made women the primary victims. Yet religion was not only a cause of the hysteria, it was also its eventual undoing. As the trials dragged on and the number of accusations swelled, some ministers began to question the proceedings. Increase Mather, Cotton Mather's father, famously declared, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This statement marked a turning point, reminding the colony that justice demanded higher standards of evidence. Religious leaders who once fueled the fire eventually helped quench it, though not before 20 lives were lost and many more destroyed. The role of religion in Salem offers a haunting lesson about the dangers of unchecked faith when fused with fear and power. The Puritans' absolute conviction in their beliefs gave them certainty but robbed them of compassion. In their quest to protect their community from Satan, they inflicted suffering on their own. Their trials reveal how a rigid worldview, once shaken by fear, can transform neighbors into enemies and faith into a weapon. When we look back on Salem today, we see not merely a cautionary tale of superstition, but a warning about the misuse of religion. Belief, when hardened into dogma and fused with fear, can justify injustice, silence reason, and destroy lives. The Salem Witch Trials stand as a testament to the power of faith for good or ill in shaping human history. Chapter 15. The role of gender and why women were targeted most when we examine the Salem Witch Trials. One fact stands out starkly: the overwhelming majority of those accused, imprisoned, and executed were women. Out of the 200 people accused of witchcraft in 1692, about 3/4 were female. This is not a coincidence, nor is it a simple reflection of chance. The trials reveal deep truths about the role of gender in Puritan society and the ways in which cultural, religious, and social attitudes toward women made them especially vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. To begin, we must understand the Puritan worldview about women. The Puritans inherited centuries of European beliefs, rooted in both religious and cultural traditions. Women were considered spiritually weaker than men, more susceptible to temptation, and more easily swayed by the devil. The biblical story of Adam and Eve was central. Eve was blamed for humanity's fall. Her act of eating the forbidden fruit, seen as proof of female weakness and disobedience. This narrative was echoed endlessly in sermons and teachings, embedding the idea that women, by their very nature, carried the seeds of sin. In daily life, Puritan women were expected to be silent, obedient, and submissive to male authority. That authority was their husband, father, or minister. Their role was confined to the domestic sphere, raising children, tending to household duties, and supporting the spiritual mission of their families. Any deviation from this role was seen as suspicious or even dangerous. Women who were outspoken, independent, or financially secure often drew the ire of their neighbors. The witchcraft accusations provided a socially sanctioned outlet for punishing women who stepped outside their prescribed roles. One striking example is Sarah Good, one of the first women accused in Salem. She was poor, often homeless, and known for her sharp tongue. When neighbors refused her requests for food or shelter, she would mutter curses under her breath. To the Puritan mind, this behavior was not simply rude or desperate, it was evidence of witchcraft. Sarah's failure to embody the ideal of quiet submission made her an easy target, and in the eyes of the community, her poverty and bitterness marked her as spiritually corrupt. Similarly, women who enjoyed a measure of independence were vulnerable. Bridget Bishop, the first woman executed in Salem, owned property and ran a tavern, a rare freedom for a woman in Puritan society. She dressed in bright, unconventional clothing and had a reputation for being bold and assertive. These traits challenged the Puritan vision of female modesty and submission. When accusations of witchcraft arose, Bishop's lifestyle served as supposed proof of her guilt. In essence, her independence was recast as devilish rebellion. The trials also revealed the dangerous intersection of gender and age. Many of the accused women were older, widowed, or childless, those who no longer fit neatly into the role of obedient wife and mother. In a society where women's value was tied to their roles within the family, such women were viewed with suspicion. Without a male protector, they were vulnerable to accusations. Their lack of children or heirs could be interpreted as a curse upon fertility, another sign of supposed witchcraft. At the same time, younger women and girls were also drawn into the hysteria, though in different ways. The initial accusers in Salem, the afflicted girls, were themselves young females, whose voices were usually suppressed in Puritan society. As teenagers and children, they had little authority or autonomy. Yet in the context of the trials, their claims of being tormented by witches elevated them to positions of extraordinary influence. Ironically, the trials both reinforced female subordination and provided a rare outlet for young women to wield power, though that power came at a terrible cost to others. Religion intensified the gendered targeting. Ministers frequently warned that women were the devil's gateway. Echoing the writings of early church fathers like Tertullian, sermons painted women as spiritually unstable, in need of constant guidance. The Puritan belief that witches entered into pacts with Satan made women the primary suspects, for they were thought to be more prone to his seductions. This view was not unique to Salem. It had fueled witch hunts in Europe for centuries. But in the tightly controlled Puritan society of Massachusetts, it reached a fever pitch. We also see gender dynamics at play in how confessions unfolded. Women who confessed to witchcraft often described being seduced or tricked by the devil, narratives that reinforced stereotypes of female weakness. By admitting guilt and presenting themselves as repentant, they sometimes avoided execution, though they were still imprisoned. But women who refused to confess, who remained defiant and proclaimed their innocence, were often executed. This dynamic punished women for asserting their voices and rewarded them only when they reinforced the very stereotypes used against them. Marriage and property rights also contributed to the gendered nature of accusations. In Puritan law, women's legal identities were tied to their husbands. Widows or unmarried women who inherited property disrupted the expected order. Their independence threatened male control and sparked resentment. In Salem, some historians have noted that accusations often targeted women, whose land could then be claimed by others once they were convicted. Thus, gender bias intertwined with economic motivations, making women both spiritually and materially vulnerable. It is important, however, to recognize that not only women were accused. Men, too, faced charges, though in much smaller numbers. Yet even here, gendered assumptions shaped outcomes. Men were more likely to be accused if they were closely tied to accused women husbands, brothers, or fathers. Their association with women suspected of witchcraft tainted them by extension. When men were accused independently, they were often portrayed as effeminate or as having failed in their masculine duties, reinforcing the idea that witchcraft was fundamentally linked to a breakdown in gender norms. One of the most tragic elements of Salem is how gender roles trapped women in a no-win situation. To be poor and dependent was suspicious. To be wealthy and independent was suspicious. To be old and childless was suspicious. To be young and outspoken was suspicious. Virtually every deviation from the narrow path of Puritan womanhood could be twisted into evidence of witchcraft. In this way, the trials served as a brutal enforcement of gender norms, punishing those who did not conform. At the same time, we must not overlook the role of women as accusers. The afflicted girls, the wives who testified against neighbors, and the women who supported the trials were all participants in the hysteria. This complicates the narrative. While the trials reveal systemic oppression of women, they also show how women internalized and perpetuated the very beliefs that harmed them. Fear, faith, and social pressure drew women into both sides of the madness. Looking back, the Salem witch trials reveal the deep entanglement of gender and power. Women, already marginalized in Puritan society, bore the brunt of suspicion. Their bodies, voices, and lives became battlegrounds on which the community's fears were played out. The hysteria exaggerated long-standing anxieties about female independence, sexuality, and authority, turning ordinary differences into deadly accusations. The gendered nature of the trials leaves us with a sobering lesson. When a society restricts women's roles, silences their voices, and views them through the lens of suspicion, the consequences can be devastating. Salem reminds us that the structures of patriarchy are not only oppressive but can become deadly when combined with fear, religion, and social upheaval. And yet, out of this tragedy, we can also see the resilience of women. Many of those accused maintained their innocence until the end, refusing to confess to crimes they did not commit. Their defiance, though it cost them their lives, stands as a testament to their strength. Today, we remember not only the injustice they suffered, but also the courage with which they faced it. The Salem Witch Trials are thus inseparable from the story of gender. They were not only about superstition and fear, but about the fragile balance of power between men and women in a rigid society. To understand why women were targeted most is to see the trials not just as an episode of hysteria, but as a reflection of the deeper inequalities and anxieties that shaped Puritan life. Chapter 16: The Impact of Family Rivalries and Community Divisions. While the Salem Witch Trials are often remembered as a story of superstition, hysteria, and religion, they were also profoundly shaped by something far more earthly: family rivalries and community divisions. Beneath the surface of the accusations lay simmering tensions over land, inheritance, wealth, and social standing. Salem Village in 1692 was not a united community, but rather a place fractured by disputes between neighbors, families, and factions. The witchcraft hysteria provided an outlet through which these old grievances could explode into deadly accusations. To grasp the role of these rivalries, we must first understand Salem Village itself. Unlike Salem Town, a bustling port engaged in commerce and trade, Salem Village was more rural, inhabited largely by subsistence farmers. Many villagers resented the growing economic influence of Salem Town and sought to preserve their agrarian way of life. At the same time, the division between the two created fault lines within the community, as some families aligned with the merchants of the town, while others clung to the village's traditional values. One of the most well-documented divisions in Salem Village was between the Putnam family and the Porter family. The Putnams were among the wealthier farming families of the village, but they resented the commercial prosperity and political influence of the Porters, who were aligned with the mercantile interests of Salem Town. These factions often clashed over land boundaries, church leadership, and local governance. When the witchcraft accusations began, the Putnams quickly emerged as some of the strongest supporters of the trials, while the Porters expressed skepticism. Not coincidentally, many of the accused witches were people who opposed or threatened Putnam interests. Take, for example, Thomas Putnam, who played a central role in promoting the accusations. His daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., was one of the afflicted girls who claimed to see visions of witches tormenting her. Anne's mother, Anne Putnam Sr., also accused neighbors of witchcraft. Historians have noted that many of the people the Putnams targeted were involved in land disputes with the family. By aligning spiritual suspicion with economic grievances, the Putnams weaponized the witch trials to weaken their rivals and solidify their standing in the village. The case of Rebecca Nurse further illustrates how community divisions shaped accusations. Nurse was a respected, elderly woman from the Town family, another prominent clan. She had lived a life of piety and was widely admired, but she also had long-standing disputes with the Putnams over property boundaries. When she was accused of witchcraft, it shocked many in the community. Even though dozens of neighbors signed petitions defending her character, the weight of the Putnams' accusations and the hysteria they fueled proved stronger. Despite her reputation, Rebecca Nurse was executed, a stark reminder of how personal grudges could override reason and justice. Beyond the great family rivalries, smaller disputes between neighbors also played a role. Salem Village was a tightly knit community where everyone knew each other's business. Minor arguments over livestock, fences, and even household chores could fester into long-standing bitterness. In a society where reputation was everything, these conflicts could easily escalate when accusations of witchcraft provided a powerful new weapon. If a cow fell ill, if butter refused to churn, or if a child sickened mysteriously, people often blamed their neighbors. And if that neighbor had once insulted them, quarreled with them, or refused a favor, the suspicion became all the more credible. The witch trials also reflected generational tensions. Younger villagers often looked to expand their independence, marry, and acquire land, while older villagers sought to protect their property and authority. This dynamic played into the trials as accusations sometimes targeted those whose inheritance patterns threatened to disrupt family expectations. For example, when young heirs or widows gained property rights, disputes with relatives could be recast as supernatural conflicts. Witchcraft accusations became a way to discipline or eliminate those who disrupted traditional family hierarchies. Another important layer of division was religious. Salem Village had long debated whether to establish its own independent church or remain tied to Salem town. Those who wanted independence supported Reverend Samuel Parris, the controversial minister at the center of the trials, while others opposed him. Parris, who was deeply unpopular with many, leaned heavily on the witchcraft accusations to consolidate his authority. Families who supported Parris often supported the trials, while those opposed to him were disproportionately accused. Thus, the hysteria both reflected and intensified the village's religious divides. Consider also how accusations clustered geographically. Historians analyzing trial records have found that accusations often followed lines of pre-existing disputes. Neighbors who had fought in court over land were more likely to accuse one another. Families who supported Parris were more likely to accuse families aligned with the Porters. The pattern suggests that witchcraft was less about supernatural fear and more about rebranding old conflicts in spiritual terms. What might once have been an argument over boundaries now became an accusation of demonic pacts. This blending of the spiritual with the personal is part of what made the Salem trials so destructive. Once the accusations began, they spread quickly, fueled not only by genuine fear, but also by the opportunity they presented for settling scores. In a small, tense community, accusations became tools of revenge. If your neighbor had wronged you, accusing them of witchcraft not only punished them but also elevated your own moral standing. The trials rewarded suspicion and punished dissent, creating a climate where grudges could masquerade as righteousness. The tragedy is that many of those accused were caught in conflicts that had little to do with them personally. For example, when Ann Putnam Jr. and the other girls accused Rebecca Nurse, they may have sincerely believed they were afflicted by witchcraft. Yet beneath their claims lay the broader Putnam-Porter feud, one that transformed an elderly grandmother into a scapegoat. Similarly, Bridget Bishop's reputation as a tavern keeper made her vulnerable, but her execution also sent a message to others whose independence threatened the village's patriarchal order. The role of family rivalries also explains why the trial has spiraled so far out of control. Once accusations began, no one was safe, because every family had some dispute with another. The hysteria fed on itself, with each accusation sparking new ones. People accused their neighbors not only to protect themselves but also to eliminate enemies. In this sense, the trials were as much a civil war within Salem Village as they were a spiritual crisis. At the end of the trials, when the community finally began to reckon with what had happened, many realized that personal grievances had played a devastating role. The apologies issued years later by participants, such as Ann Putnam Jr., reveal this awareness. She admitted that Satan deluded me into accusing innocent people. But historians see her words as reflecting the broader truth. The devil Salem feared was not only a supernatural force, but also the very human forces of envy, rivalry, and division. Looking back, we see that the Salem witch trials were not only a product of religious fervor and superstition, but also a mirror of the social fractures in the village. Family rivalries, land disputes, and community divisions provided fertile ground for the hysteria. Without these tensions, the accusations might never have spread so far or claimed so many lives. The story of Salem is therefore not just about witches or the supernatural. It is about how human conflicts, envy, jealousy, and greed can hide behind the language of faith and morality. The trials remind us that communities divided against themselves are vulnerable to fear and suspicion, and that when old grudges find new outlets, the results can be catastrophic. Chapter 17: The Influence of Religion and Puritan Beliefs. To truly understand the Salem witch trials, we must enter the world of the Puritans, a people who believed with absolute certainty that every aspect of their lives was watched, guided, and judged by God. For the Puritans of 17th century New England, religion was not just a Sunday ritual, it was the foundation of society, government, and personal identity. Their worldview shaped how they interpreted the events in Salem, turning ordinary misfortunes, into signs of spiritual warfare and transforming community disputes into battles between God and Satan. Without Puritan beliefs, the hysteria of 1692 could never have unfolded in the way it did. The Puritans had left England in the early 1600s to escape what they saw as corruption in the Church of England. They wanted to build a city upon a hill, a model Christian society that would shine as an example to the world. In this society, faith was absolute, discipline was strict, and sin was punished. To them, the Bible was not only a spiritual guide, but also a manual for daily life. Every drought, storm, or sickness was seen as a message from God. Every success was proof of His blessing. Every hardship was a test of faith. One of the central Puritan beliefs was in the reality of the devil. They were convinced that Satan was constantly at work, seeking to undermine God's kingdom on earth. Witches, in this worldview, were not simply people practicing strange rituals, but active agents of the devil. By making a covenant with Satan, witches were thought to have gained supernatural powers in exchange for serving evil. This made witchcraft not merely a crime, but an act of treason against God Himself. This belief explains why accusations of witchcraft were taken so seriously. In a community already anxious about crop failures, disease, and the threats of Native American raids, the idea that witches were attacking them was terrifying. Every misfortune could be interpreted as a sign of witchcraft. If a cow suddenly died, it might not have been disease, it could have been the curse of a neighbor. If a child fell sick with strange symptoms, it was not only an illness but possibly evidence of spiritual torment. The Puritan obsession with signs and omens also played a role. They believed that God communicated through the events of daily life. A sudden accident, a fire, or a failed harvest might be punishment for sin in the community. Because of this worldview, the strange fits and convulsions of the afflicted girls were not seen as medical problems but as spiritual ones. Their writhing bodies, screams, and visions were interpreted as proof that witches were tormenting them. Another key element of Puritan belief was the doctrine of predestination. According to this theology, God had already chosen who would be saved, the elect, and who would be damned. Nothing one did in life could change this destiny. However, outward signs of holiness and obedience were thought to reveal one's status. As a result, Puritans were deeply concerned with moral behavior, not only their own, but also that of their neighbors. To tolerate sin in the community was to risk God's wrath on everyone. Thus, when witchcraft was suspected, it became a communal duty to root it out. This collective responsibility meant that accusations of witchcraft spread quickly. If even one person was secretly a witch, the entire community was believed to be in danger. Ministers preached that failing to confront sin was itself a sin. In this way, the religious culture encouraged people to suspect one another. A strange look from a neighbor, a forgotten prayer, or a refusal to attend church could all be reinterpreted as evidence of witchcraft. Puritan sermons also reinforced fear of the devil. Ministers like Cotton Mather and Increase Mather wrote extensively about the dangers of witchcraft and the reality of Satan's schemes. Cotton Mather's book, Memorable Providences, described the case of a supposed witch in Boston, offering it as evidence of the devil's work in New England. When the trials began in Salem, his writings were often cited as proof that witchcraft was real and deadly. For ordinary Puritans, such teachings were not mere theory, they were warnings that evil was present in their very midst. The Puritan view of women also shaped the trials. Women were seen as spiritually weaker, more vulnerable to temptation, and more likely to fall under Satan's influence. The biblical story of Eve's temptation in the Garden of Eden was often cited as evidence. As a result, the majority of those accused of witchcraft were women, particularly those who did not conform to the expected roles of pious wife and mother. Widows, unmarried women, or those who spoke too freely were seen as suspicious. Religious beliefs about gender thus intersected with social tensions to make certain women especially vulnerable. Religious rituals also played a part in the trials. Prayers, fasting, and examinations of conscience were common responses to misfortune. When these practices failed to solve the crisis of the afflicted girls, suspicion grew that something truly diabolical was at work. Ministers called for days of fasting and repentance, urging the community to purge sin. This spiritual climate intensified fear and created pressure to identify hidden witches. It is important to remember that the Puritans did not see themselves as acting irrationally. To them, the evidence was consistent with their worldview. The Bible itself, in passages such as Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," commanded the punishment of witches. They believed they were obeying God's word by prosecuting suspected witches. In their eyes, failing to act would have been not only cowardice, but also disobedience to divine law. However, the same religious beliefs that fueled the trials also eventually contributed to their downfall. As the accusations grew more outrageous, some ministers began to worry that the devil was deceiving the community. Cotton Mather, while initially supportive, later warned against relying too heavily on spectral evidence, the visions and dreams of the afflicted girls. Increased Mather famously declared, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned." This shift reflected the Puritan concern with justice and the fear of sinning against God by shedding innocent blood. When the trials finally ended, the religious community faced a deep crisis. How could a godly society have condemned so many innocent people? For many Puritans, the trials became a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear and zeal override reason. In 1697, a day of fasting and repentance was held to atone for the tragedy. Later, in 1706, Anne Putnam Jr. publicly confessed her role, acknowledging that she had been misled by Satan. These acts of repentance were deeply rooted in the Puritan belief that sin must be confessed before God. Looking back, we can see that Puritan religion was both the spark and the fuel of the Salem Witch Trials. Their belief in the devil made witchcraft seem real and terrifying. Their sense of communal responsibility turned suspicion into mass hysteria. Their strict moral code made nonconformity seem dangerous, and their reliance on scripture gave the trials a sense of divine legitimacy. Yet their same religious devotion also forced them to confront their mistakes and seek forgiveness. The Salem Witch Trials remind us that religion, when combined with fear, can become a powerful force capable of inspiring unity, but also of unleashing terrible injustice. For the Puritans, the trials were a test of faith. For us today, they stand as a warning of how deeply beliefs can shape perception, and how dangerous it can be when fear and conviction overwhelm compassion and reason. Chapter 18, The Role of Gender and the Targeting of Women. When we study the Salem Witch Trials, one pattern stands out immediately. The overwhelming majority of those accused, imprisoned, and executed were women. This fact is not coincidental. Gender played a central role in shaping who was accused of witchcraft, how they were treated, and how the wider community interpreted their alleged crimes. In a Puritan society built on strict religious and social norms, women occupied a precarious position, expected to be submissive, obedient, and pious, yet constantly viewed as spiritually vulnerable and morally suspect. To understand the Salem tragedy, we must examine how gender dynamics, cultural beliefs about women, and long-standing prejudices fueled the hysteria. In 17th-century Puritan New England, women's lives were tightly controlled by both religion and social custom. They were expected to marry, bear children, and manage households. Education for women was limited, and political or religious authority was almost entirely denied to them. Puritan sermons often emphasized that women, like Eve in the Garden of Eden, were more easily tempted by the devil and therefore more likely to become instruments of Satan. This teaching, deeply ingrained in the culture, made women natural targets. When accusations of witchcraft began to spread, of the approximately 200 people accused during the Salem crisis, roughly 78% were women. Most of those who faced execution were also women. The very idea of a witch was gendered. In the Puritan imagination, witches were almost always female figures, cackling, vengeful, and in league with Satan. When men were accused, it was often because of their association with women who had already been charged, such as husbands or relatives. Thus, the trials reflected not only religious fear, but also a culture steeped in gendered assumptions about sin and temptation. Women who did not conform to societal expectations were especially vulnerable. Widows, spinsters, and childless women were frequent targets. In a society that valued women primarily as wives and mothers, those who lived outside these roles were often viewed with suspicion. Without the protection of a husband, they were more likely to be seen as independent, outspoken, or troublesome. Their unusual status in the community made them easy scapegoats when misfortune struck. Economic independence also made some women targets. Take the case of Bridget Bishop, the first woman executed during the Salem trials. She was a tavern owner who dressed in brightly colored clothing, enjoyed social gatherings, and had a reputation for defying the strict moral codes of Puritan society. To her neighbors, she represented everything a woman should not be: bold, independent, and unwilling to submit. When accusations of witchcraft began, Bishop's behavior and lifestyle marked her as suspicious, and she was quickly condemned. Similarly, Sarah Good, another early victim of the trials, was a poor, homeless woman who often begged from neighbors. When denied, she was known to mutter under her breath, behavior easily interpreted as casting curses. In a society that prized conformity and obedience, her poverty and defiance made her a convenient target. Her execution reflected how gender roles intersected with class prejudice, punishing women who did not fit neatly into the Puritan ideal. The accusations also reflected anxieties about female power. Midwives, healers, and women with knowledge of herbal medicine were often accused of witchcraft. Their ability to heal or harm through natural remedies gave them influence that could be interpreted as supernatural. In a culture dominated by male ministers and physicians, women's traditional roles in health and childbirth were both necessary and threatening. If a child died in childbirth or a mother fell ill, suspicion could quickly fall on the midwife. Thus, the very skills that gave women authority in their communities became grounds for condemnation. Another important factor was women's speech. Puritan society valued silence and submission in women, yet those who spoke out, whether by criticizing authority, defending themselves, or gossiping, risked being seen as disruptive. Accused women who protested their innocence often made things worse. Their anger or defiance was read as evidence of guilt. By contrast, women who remained silent could be condemned for failing to defend themselves. In this way, no response could fully protect them. The testimonies of the afflicted girls also reflected gender dynamics. Most of the afflicted were young women and girls, whose accusations carried enormous weight in court. Their fits, screams, and visions were interpreted as signs of spiritual torment, and their words were treated as credible evidence. In a society where young women had little authority, the trials gave them a sudden and dangerous power. Some historians argued that their accusations may have been a way to express frustrations with rigid gender roles, turning their vulnerability into influence. Yet their power came at the expense of other women, many of whom were destroyed by their words. Gender also shaped the way the accused were portrayed in court. Witches were often described as seductive, manipulative, or envious traits traditionally associated with negative stereotypes of women. Even the devil himself was said to appear to women more often than to men, offering them power in exchange for loyalty. These narratives reinforced the idea that women were uniquely susceptible to sin and corruption. Men accused of witchcraft, by contrast, were sometimes seen as victims, misled by women rather than as active agents of evil. At the same time, not all women were victims in Salem. Some participated in the accusations, using them to settle personal scores or to remove rivals. Accusing others of witchcraft could protect a woman from suspicion or elevate her status. For example, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the leading accusers, was instrumental in fueling the hysteria. Her family's rivalries with other households may have influenced her accusations. Thus, while women were disproportionately targeted, they were also active participants in the process. It is also important to recognize how the trials reflected broader European traditions. Across Europe, during centuries of witch hunts, women made up the majority of those accused and executed. The same religious and cultural beliefs about women's weakness and susceptibility to the devil traveled with the Puritans to New England. Salem was not an isolated event, but part of a much larger history of gendered persecution. The targeting of women in Salem also reveals deeper fears about social change. By the late 17th century, New England was undergoing economic and cultural shifts. Traditional Puritan values were under strain as commerce, trade, and individualism grew. Independent women, widows managing property, or those living outside the strict patriarchal order symbolized these changes. The witch trials became a way to reassert control, punishing those who challenged or simply failed to conform to the traditional gender hierarchy. Even after the trials ended, the association between women and witchcraft persisted. The memory of Salem reinforced cultural stereotypes of dangerous or unruly women, yet it also left behind a legacy of caution. Over time, the tragedy of Salem contributed to a broader skepticism about witch hunts, and a recognition of the dangers of gendered fear. In later centuries, feminists would revisit the trials as an example of how patriarchal societies use fear and accusation to control women. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials cannot be understood without examining the role of gender. The majority of victims were women, targeted because of cultural fears, religious beliefs, and social anxieties about female power. Their stories reveal not only the dangers of superstition, but also the enduring impact of gender inequality. Salem was a crucible where fear, religion, and gender roles collided, leaving a legacy of injustice that continues to resonate today. Chapter 19: The Courtroom Drama and the Spectral Evidence. Salem witch trials reached their most dramatic and dangerous moments inside the crowded, tension-filled courtrooms of Massachusetts in 1692. It was here that accusations were transformed into convictions, where fear was turned into sentences of death, and where one of the most infamous tools of injustice's spectral evidence was used as a primary weapon. The court proceedings did not simply reflect the hysteria of the community. They amplified it, giving authority and legitimacy to claims that otherwise might have seemed impossible. To understand the Salem tragedy, one must step inside these courtrooms, listen to the testimonies, and witness the dangerous blending of fear, superstition, and flawed legal reasoning that sealed so many fates. When Governor William Phips established the Court of Oyer and Termina in May 1692, he sought to restore order to a colony overwhelmed by panic. Yet, the very structure of the court and its reliance on extraordinary evidence ensured that chaos would only deepen. The judges, among them figures like Samuel Sewall and William Stoughton, were not neutral arbiters but devout Puritans, steeped in the belief that the devil actively sought to infiltrate their community. In their eyes, witchcraft was not only possible but a present and urgent threat. They entered the courtroom determined to root it out, no matter the cost. The accused were often brought into the courtroom in chains, their faces pale from weeks or months in dank prisons. The galleries were crowded with neighbors, relatives, and the curious public, all eager to see the unfolding spectacle. But the most dramatic presence was that of the afflicted girls, young women, and children, whose fits, screams, and visions became the centerpiece of the trials. At the mere glance of the accused, the girls would convulse, shriek, or collapse, insisting that invisible specters were tormenting them. Their performances captivated audiences and convinced judges that something supernatural was at play. This led to the most infamous practice of the trials, the acceptance of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that the spirit, or specter, of the accused had appeared to the afflicted in visions or dreams, tormenting them despite the accused's physical absence. In essence, it was proof based, not on physical fact but on unseen and unverifiable experiences. The afflicted would point to the accused and claim that their specter stood beside them, pinching, choking, or clawing at their souls. Judges treated these claims as legitimate, reasoning that the devil could not use a person's specter without their permission. The implications were devastating. With spectral evidence, no one was safe. How could an accused person disprove an invisible act? How could they argue against a vision seen only in the mind of another? If a girl screamed that she saw a specter, the accused was trapped in a cycle of suspicion with no escape. Silence could be taken as guilt, protest as defiance, and denial as further proof that the devil had hardened their heart. The reliance on spectral evidence created a theater of hysteria in the courtroom. Witnesses wept, the afflicted contorted their bodies, and judges sternly demanded confessions. Every gesture, word, or expression of the accused was scrutinized. If they crossed their arms, it might be interpreted as casting a curse. If they sighed, it could be taken as a sign of communion with the devil. The trials became less about facts and more about perception. With fear blurring the line between justice and spectacle, some accused individuals attempted to fight back with reason. Rebecca Nurse, a respected and elderly woman, stood before the court with dignity, insisting on her innocence. Her calm demeanor initially won her supporters, and she was even acquitted at first. Yet the afflicted erupted in fits, crying out that Nurse's specter tormented them in that very moment. Under the weight of such emotional displays, the jury reversed its decision, and Nurse was condemned. Her case illustrated the futility of reason in a courtroom ruled by hysteria. Others, like Martha Corey, openly mocked the afflicted, accusing them of lying. Her skepticism only sealed her fate. as judges interpreted her defiance as the arrogance of guilt. Still others, like Sarah Good, denied accusations until the end, only to be met with further accusations from children claiming that her spectre whispered in their ears. Each attempt to resist was twisted into evidence against the accused. Courtroom also magnified existing tensions in the community. Long-standing feuds, rivalries, and grudges played out in accusations and testimonies. Neighbors testified against neighbors, sometimes with little more than vague suspicions. A cow that fell ill, a crop that failed, or a child that sickened, could all be tied back to the malevolent influence of a supposed witch. Under oath, these suspicions became evidence, reinforcing the cycle of fear. The judges themselves fueled the drama. Chief Justice William Stoughton, in particular, was a firm believer in the reality of witchcraft and pushed for swift convictions. He saw skepticism as dangerous leniency and often pressed accused individuals to confess, promising mercy in exchange for admission of guilt. This practice created another injustice: false confessions. Some accused individuals, faced with death, admitted to crimes they had never committed, hoping to save their lives. Others implicated friends and neighbors in desperate attempts to lessen their own punishment. The use of spectral evidence became increasingly controversial as the trials progressed. Ministers such as Increase Mather began to question its validity, arguing that the devil could, in fact, use the spectre of innocent people to deceive. To rely on visions and dreams as the basis for execution, he warned, risked condemning the innocent. His son, Cotton Mather, while supportive of the trials, also expressed unease with over-reliance on spectral evidence. Yet these doubts came too late for many victims, as the court had already executed dozens on the strength of spectral claims. The emotional intensity of the courtroom cannot be overstated. For those accused, it was a place of terror, where the odds were stacked against them from the moment they entered. For the afflicted, it was a stage upon which they could command attention and wield unprecedented power. For the judges and jurors, it was a test of faith, where they believed themselves to be soldiers in a cosmic battle against Satan himself. Each trial was more than a legal proceeding, it was a spiritual drama, with eternal consequences imagined to be at stake. As the executions mounted and the evidence grew increasingly tenuous, doubts began to spread. Governor Phipps himself grew alarmed at the scale of the crisis, particularly when accusations reached members of elite families and even his own household. In October 1692, he finally ordered the Court of Oyer and Terminor dissolved. In its place, a new court was established that was instructed to no longer accept spectral evidence. With that single change, the tide of convictions slowed dramatically, and the hysteria began to subside. Looking back, the reliance on spectral evidence stands as one of the clearest examples of how fear can undermine justice. The Salem courtrooms show us how easily truth can be distorted when fear is given authority and when emotion overwhelms reason. The trials remind us of the dangers of substituting belief for fact and of allowing the intangible to dictate life and death decisions. The courtroom drama of Salem was more than a tragic chapter of colonial history. It was a warning. It revealed the destructive potential of hysteria when amplified by flawed institutions. It showed how vulnerable justice becomes when evidence is based on perception rather than proof. And it illustrated how ordinary people, driven by fear, can transform into participants in injustice. The echoes of those courtrooms still resonate. They remind us that justice demands evidence, fairness, and reason, not visions, suspicions, or hysteria. In the end, the Salem witch trials were not simply the result of superstition, but of a legal system that gave fear the force of law. Chapter 20: Legacy of the Salem Witch Trials. The Salem witch trials did not end with the final execution in 1692, nor with the closing of the Court of Oyer and Termina. Their legacy endured, casting a shadow across Massachusetts and eventually the entire history of the United States. What unfolded in Salem was not just a local tragedy, but a defining moment that revealed how fear, power, and belief can combine to destroy lives and fracture communities. The aftermath forced both individuals and the colony to reckon with guilt, repentance, and questions of justice. In later centuries, historians, writers, and artists would return to the Salem witch trials again and again, seeking to understand not only what happened, but why and what lessons it holds for all societies. In the immediate aftermath, Salem was a town haunted by grief and shame. Families of the executed carried both sorrow and stigma, struggling to recover from the loss of loved ones and the public disgrace of having been branded as witches. Property was often confiscated, homes and farms left in disarray, and reputations destroyed. The prisons, once overcrowded with accused men and women, emptied gradually. But freedom did not erase the scars of wrongful imprisonment. Even those who survived bore the weight of humiliation and trauma, knowing that neighbors and courts had once been willing to condemn them to death based on nothing more than fear and suspicion. Governor William Phips, who had once empowered the trials, sought to distance himself from the catastrophe by dissolving the court of Oya and Termina and establishing a new court that rejected spectral evidence. He attempted to restore order. In 1693, many of the remaining accused were pardoned and prosecutions dwindled. But the damage had been done. By the end of the crisis, more than 200 people had been accused, 30 convicted, and 19 executed by hanging. One man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death under heavy stones. Countless others suffered imprisonment, loss of property, and irreparable harm to their reputations. The colony soon recognized the need for atonement. Ministers such as Increase Mather publicly admitted that reliance on spectral evidence had been a grievous error. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned, he declared, in stark contrast to the zeal that had fueled the trials. This shift in tone reflected not only religious reconsideration, but also political necessity. The leadership of Massachusetts needed to restore public trust in its institutions. Over the years, the colony began to issue apologies and reparations. In 1697, the General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching to atone for the tragedy. Judges like Samuel Sewall publicly confessed their guilt and begged forgiveness. Sewall's confession was especially powerful. Standing before his congregation, he acknowledged his role in condemning the innocent and accepted blame and shame for his part. His words marked one of the earliest public acts of accountability in American legal history. By the early 18th century, financial compensation was granted to many of the families of the accused. While money could never restore lost lives or heal the deepest wounds, these reparations were a symbolic acknowledgement that the government had wronged its own people. Still, the scars ran deep, shaping the identity of Salem and leaving a legacy of cautionary tales. The trials also left behind an enduring cultural imprint. In literature, the Salem Witch Trials became a symbol of mass hysteria, injustice, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of one of the judges, grappled with the legacy of his ancestors' actions in works like The House of the Seven Gables. His sense of inherited guilt reflected the way the trials haunted families long after the events had ended. Centuries later, Arthur Miller would revisit Salem in The Crucible, using the trials as an allegory for McCarthyism in the 1950s. Miller's play captured the timeless nature of Salem's tragedy, showing how fear-driven persecution could repeat itself in different contexts. The Salem Witch Trials also influenced American legal thought. The rejection of spectral evidence and the later apologies served as a warning about the dangers of relying on intangible, unverifiable claims in a court of law. The trials underscored the importance of due process, evidence-based reasoning, and protections against hysteria-driven accusations. While justice in colonial America was still far from modern standards, the lessons of Salem contributed to the gradual evolution of American legal principles that placed higher value on evidence, rights of the accused, and the presumption of innocence. In a broader sense, the Salem tragedy exposed the fragility of social order in times of fear. It demonstrated how quickly communities could unravel when fear was given authority and suspicion replaced trust. The witch trials were not simply the result of superstition. They were the product of deep social tensions, from disputes over land to anxieties about war, gender, and religion. Salem revealed how fear could exploit these fractures, turning neighbor against neighbor and belief into a weapon. Today, the legacy of the Salem witch trials remains alive, both as a subject of historical study and as a cultural touchstone. Salem itself has transformed into a place of remembrance and tourism, where visitors walk the same streets and visit the memorials honoring those who were executed. The Witch Trials Memorial in Salem stands as a solemn reminder of the lives lost, with the names of the victims carved in stone to preserve their memory. These spaces invite reflection, not only on what happened in 1692, but also on how societies must guard against repeating such injustices. Beyond Salem, the trials continued to resonate in discussions of human rights, justice, and mass hysteria. They serve as a reminder that persecution often begins not with overwhelming evidence but with fear, suspicion, and the willingness to believe the worst about others. In every era where accusations spread without proof, whether during the Red Scare, in times of war, or even in the digital age of misinformation, the shadow of Salem re-emerges as a warning. The legacy also lives in the language we use. The term witch hunt has become a metaphor for baseless persecution, invoked in political debates, journalism, and public discourse. While its casual use sometimes distances us from the gravity of the original events, it underscores the lasting power of Salem's tragedy to shape the way we talk about injustice. For the descendants of those accused, the trials remain a personal history. Many families have traced their lineage back to Salem, reclaiming the names of ancestors who were once condemned. Some see this as an act of healing, restoring dignity to those who suffered. Others see it as a reminder of how fragile justice can be, and how isolated communities can turn against their own. Ultimately, the Salem witch trials endure as one of the darkest chapters in American history, not simply because of the lives lost, but because of what they reveal about human nature. They show us the dangers of fear unchecked, the perils of blind belief, and the consequences of abandoning reason in the pursuit of security. They also remind us that justice is not self-sustaining. It must be protected, questioned, and defended against the forces of hysteria. As we close this exploration of the Salem witch trials, we are left with lessons that remain urgently relevant. Fear can be persuasive, hysteria can be contagious, and injustice, once unleashed, can spread with terrifying speed. But just as the people of Salem eventually recognized their errors, so too can societies learn, reflect, and strive to prevent the repetition of such tragedies. The true legacy of Salem lies not only in its tragedy but in its caution, a timeless reminder to hold fast to reason, fairness, and compassion, even when fear tempts us to abandon them. The voices of those lost in Salem, Rebecca, Nurse, Giles, Corey, Sarah Good, and so many others still echo through history. They remind us that justice without evidence is not justice at all, and that truth must never be sacrificed to fear. In remembering them, we honor their memory and safeguard the lessons of their suffering, ensuring that the darkness of Salem is never forgotten and never repeated. The Salem witch trials remind us that fear and hysteria can be more dangerous than any spell or curse. Innocent lives were lost, and history was forever marked by paranoia. But these dark stories are not just the past, they are warnings for the present. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden and terrifying chapters of history, don't forget to subscribe to Dark History. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode, and share this with others who dare to look into the dark. Until next time, remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened.